being at SCORE for about now 7.5 years. Yeah, I started my career as an educator in Memphis, where I taught math, middle school math, and high school English over a number of years. And so I come at this with not just like a, oh, this is fascinating, but like I think about these data that we talk about, these were at some point were my kids that I taught and saw every single day. So just really excited to be here with you. And Francisco, your turn.
Yeah, I'm Francisco Santelli. I am a PhD student at Vanderbilt. I'll talk a little bit about more what I study. But I also was an educator now about not 7 years ago, but I guess 5 or 6 years ago. I don't know, I've been at Vanderbilt forever at this point. And I used to teach high school English, mostly ninth graders, and I was a debate coach at Gainesville High School in Gainesville, Florida for 5 years. I'll talk a little bit more about my journey into doing policy stuff, but that's kind of where I'm coming from. Just kind of how this session is going to be structured today. First of all, you're probably going to see this cat a few times because she likes to hang out. So please disregard or regard her to your desire. We're going to start off just with an introductory activity. Then I'm going to talk about some kind of basic statistics stuff and thinking about data critically from kind of the researcher perspective, share some data sources. And then Peter's going to jump into talking more about doing advocacy, the kind of work that he does, and how to think about that. And then we're going to, at the end, have some time where we'll go into breakout groups, and Peter and I will be at your disposal to answer any questions that you might have. We'll both talk about kind of what our roles are and kind of what we can do to help you out. And just to talk about any kind of research or data issues that you're interested in. With that said, just a couple of Zoom norms. First, I mean, everyone knows this at this point. I made this when we were like new to Zoom, just turn on your mic when you're speaking. Please feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have questions or you want to comment on something. I'm not super sensitive to that, and it's going to be hard for me to like see a hand raise or something like that. I think, Peter, do you mind like monitoring the chat just in case there's anything? I'll do the same for you. But yeah, feel free to chat in the chat room. I might not see it, but Peter will pull out anything that seems really interesting or any questions that show up there. Also, like I said, feel free to answer questions out loud. I'm going to ask some questions, so feel free to just turn off your mic and answer them. You're not going to offend me if you have to step away or turn off your camera or anything like that. So turn on your video only if you're comfortable doing so. I know sometimes I don't want my camera on because Peter saw my hair yesterday. I didn't want to show that to anyone because my hair in its natural state is just like and then also feel free to wave at any of the visiting pets. Serena, the cat, will come. I've got Barkley, the pup, next to me, and then my puppy Mahi is currently in her crate in the room back there because she would otherwise just tear up everything while I'm doing this. As an introductory activity, I'm going to drop a link in the chat. We want you to think about, there's a link to a Padlet. I'll show you how to use it in a second. I want to think about where you land now in these three categories and where you aspire to be someday. This is kind of your comfort level of using data. The first is data allergic. So I don't feel comfortable touching data unless someone else asks me to, or someone else gives me the data insight that I need. The second is a data advocate. So I feel comfortable using data to advocate changes that I believe in, like I might pull tables from other sources, things like that. But I'm not sure how to run my own data analysis. And then finally, we have the data analyzer. So that's someone who has a strong working knowledge of how to use data to create your own analyses and do advocacy. So you can take a data set and do some analysis with it. I've set up a Padlet, which I will share also. Hold on. There we go. And if you go to the link that I shared, did that work? you can share your response here by just clicking the plus sign. You can write kind of whatever you want, like I am a data analyzer, but kind of against my will. And you publish it and it'll show up here. So tell us just over a couple moments, where do you land now out of these three categories? I have them up here too. And where do you aspire to be? You can also add GIFs, which my student showed me when I was teaching data analysis course.
So how do we respond to the Padlet?
Oh, sorry. So there's a link in the chat. So if you click on there, it'll bring you this page. And then if you look at the bottom right, there's a plus sign. And if you just click that, you can write whatever you want. And it'll show up on here. Nice, we have data analyzers here. Data advocalizer.
Wow, that's like that's a new one, Francisco.
Yeah,
I've not heard that one.
It's an A+ portmanteau. Pulling out my old English teacher knowledge.
Also affirms our desire to make all the data A, with the alliteration. That is working out pretty good.
Yeah, good. A lot of data analyzers. So it seems like we have people that have comfort with data. Pulling out graphs, data, but we still have folks that are data allergic, which we'll talk about. That's absolutely fine. Some people that can, pull out or who can actually kind of complete their own analysis, which is, tough skill. And I saw one response. Here we go. I'm a data advocate. I love data, but I believe that data is often misused. I think that's one. That's like kind of the whole thing with my dissertation right now that I'm getting into. But secondly, I think that's something we're going to kind of cover a little bit today too. It's thinking about how to use data well. So it sounds like, I think compared to last year, we have folks that are feeling a lot more comfortable with using data, which is great. But still some folks that feel like that you're feeling rusty, or that maybe you don't feel like not comfortable is not the right word, confident in quantitative data. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today, and talk about kind of what we can do to look at data more critically and make sure that we're kind of interrogating the underlying assumptions of data use. So let's go ahead back to the presentation. This is like the most Zoom things I've done in a while. And I just, I think Peter and I wanted to share a little bit that it's okay to feel uncomfortable using data. There's people like us and others that are here for you. I think about advocacy as kind of a team sport. There are a lot of people with a lot of different roles. I'm going to talk a little bit about my role as a researcher and what I do. And I have a set of skills. I can do some fancy things, but there's a whole other set of skills I absolutely don't have. And Peter has some of those skills. And then Peter and I both have a set of skill, or you all have a set of skills that Peter and I don't have, or you're in a position, have experiences I don't have. And so really advocacy is something that we think about as, like I said, a team sport, something that we kind of all do together and we team up on and we network together to make sure that we're getting each other all the good information that we need to. And also in addition to that, we're able to use kind of all of our strengths together to actually do advocacy. Peter, do you have anything to add to that too?
Francisco, I think you said it best, and I just want to double stamp the, like, you know, and I'll talk a little about this in my section too. Is like even to that that comment about data being misused, right? I think there is a lot to be said about who gets to ask the question, why, who gets to answer the question, and all of that like has a sort of tension. And I think Francisco can get into this, but like at the end of the day, though, there is that sort of moment when my assumption is that you have something you want to change. And in that moment, you're just gonna have to do something, and it's never quite gonna be perfect. It can always get better. And so I think that's what I would say is like, even as I am supposed to be one of the people who understands data, I will tell you, I also know my limitations of the things that I don't know. And the point, and Francisco's point on this being a team sport is such a powerful one, and I want to just double stamp that.
Speaking of team sports, this is a picture of me as a teacher getting ready for the student faculty basketball game. You can see it says here, watch Mr. Santelli play basketball in quotations, because that's very bad. But this is who I am. I'm Francisco Santelli. I used to teach 9th grade English at public high school. And I had kind of a long journey with learning how to use data. I recognize kind of as teachers, we're often not trained on how to use data, but we're expected to use data all the time. And so I found myself in a lot of positions where we'd have these data chats and things like that, where no one kind of knew what they were talking about. And I didn't know what I was talking about. And I think we end up using data a lot of times in ways that harm students. We'd focus on kind of like average scores on individual questions on one test, linked to like one standard, and we make choices about what we're teaching and what we shouldn't be teaching. And today we'll kind of learn a bit why just focusing on averages is maybe a harmful approach. But what I noticed as I started to also do advocacy work back in Gainesville, Florida, I realized that I really need to know a lot more about how to parse data and research to be a better advocate. And so that's kind of when I decided to join the master's program at Vanderbilt University, learn a lot more about public policy. So I moved on from being a teacher exclusively. I still sometimes teach classes at Vanderbilt, to doing kind of a lot of this, which is just sitting in front of my computer, doing a lot of coding, and doing a lot of quantitative analysis, although now I'm moving into doing some qualitative analysis too. So things that I study, I study school leadership. So my dissertation is on school leadership hiring and the ways that process can potentially lead to inequitable outcomes for students, for candidates. I've also studied, I have a paper out, another paper that hopefully will be coming out on racial isolation among teachers in Tennessee, where we're finding how, being one of a few of your own race or ethnicity is associated with all these kinds of different outcomes in the school where you teach, including lower satisfaction, lower levels of collaboration among teachers, higher levels of turnover. So that's the kind of research that I do. And then I just kind of do things that are interesting to districts when they are interested in doing research. But generally, how I think about my role as a researcher, how I fit into this team of advocacy is, for me, I think the overall goal of my research is to ensure that there's equitable educational opportunities for students, teachers, and leaders, all of whom are constituents of the educational system. So students are probably, we would all agree, I think, the most important constituent of the educational system, but teachers and leaders are also important because they're the ones that are getting the work done. I also, just generally as a researcher, I look for gaps in what we know about education, especially if those gaps are things that are important to practitioners. And I try to link quantitative and qualitative data together to have a better understanding of how schools work. So for example, in my dissertation, I'm interviewing people in this district, leaders, people that applied for school leadership jobs. I'm also looking at their quantitative application data. And I'm linking that information together to get a better understanding of what's going on. Another example might be those papers I was talking about on racial isolation. There's a lot of qualitative research on the experiences of racially isolated Black and Latinx teachers in schools. But what we were looking for is, hey, can we see if this is happening on a broad scale? And because we have all this Tennessee Educator Survey data in the state of Tennessee, we were able to do that and kind of link together that qualitative and quantitative information to make a bigger picture. And I try to share my knowledge and my time as freely as I can. And the kinds of things I can do as a researcher to help you out are to find good research on a topic you're curious about, save you a lot of time searching. Also, I can send you PDFs maybe of things that aren't available because they're in research databases and behind expensive paywalls, which is ridiculous. I can link you up with other researchers. I have one set of specialized knowledge, but I know a bunch of other people with different sets of specialized knowledge. And so I can kind of, if you go to me and say, hey, Francisco, I kind of want to know about this. And I say, well, I don't know about this, but you know, some of you are working with Nicole Joseph. Nicole Joseph knows a lot about this. So you should talk to her. And also I can point you to good data sources, and I'll do a little bit of that here. So places where you can find data to use to answer the kinds of questions you want. And I can save you a lot of time there too. Peter can save you a lot of time there. So our goals for this part of the session are first to just kind of learn what kind of questions quantitative data specifically can answer, to learn the theory and practice of applying data to understand key challenges and to advance advocacy, and to also learn to think about quantitative data with a critical lens. And the next step, Peter's going to talk about being a data-equipped advocate. Now, like I said, data is not always quantitative, even though when we say data, that's kind of the first thing that pops in our head. But today we're going to be kind of focusing on that end. So why do we use quantitative data? Well, one thing I want to emphasize is that quantitative data is a human construction. It doesn't occur like naturally in the universe. Sometimes we think about data just as this pre-existing thing, but what quantitative data is a human process where we take complex information on social problems and we categorize it to try to examine broad patterns. And we as humans make a lot of decisions along the way to as to how to measure things, how to categorize them, and how to ask questions about the patterns there. So data is not something that just occurs naturally and shows up on the computer. Oftentimes I think a lot of people treat it that way when they're making decisions. Now, we can use that quantitative data to do three big things: to diagnose a problem, to monitor progress, or to evaluate a solution. So one way to think about this is like class assignments as an example. You give all of your kids an assignment and you, because you're trying to measure some kind of standard, and you see how they do. You can use that data from that assignment to diagnose a problem, so figure out more about a problem. Maybe we use class assignment to diagnose whether a student or many students are having a challenging time with something that we're trying to teach them, or we're looking for specific parts of that thing that they're having trouble with. And we can use the data from that classroom assignment to diagnose that. We can monitor progress, so we can keep track of whether our approach to solving a problem is working. So we might teach something in a new way, and we just keeping track with more assignments, and we see whether students are improving. And that might give us some evidence that, oh, we did this new approach to teaching this thing, and the students are improving, so this way of working is probably, or this way of teaching is probably helping them out. And we might not be able to say for sure whether that new way of teaching caused a change or not, but or whether there's something else that did. That at least gives us some evidence. The last thing we can do is evaluate a solution to see if some approach to solving a problem actually caused the change. So you might have other teachers use your approach and see if their students also do better, which would give you evidence that that way of solving the problem, that new way of teaching, is causing a change in what the students are learning. But getting at the cause of something is really hard. Last year when I did this presentation, I was just coming off of a class called Causal Inference, which was the whole class was talking about that, and it was a mess. But still, that's something that we can kind of talk about, partner with researchers to kind of figure out. So, what are some questions that we could answer in these categories? Well, let's think about, today I'm going to use an example of student discipline rates using data that I pulled out from the Tennessee Department of Education. I'll talk about that in a bit. We could answer a few different types of questions with that data. We could diagnose a problem. Maybe we have a sense that discipline is disproportional in the state of Tennessee, and we want to see if that's a broad pattern or not. We could ask the question, how do suspension rates vary by students' race and ethnicity? That's a diagnostic question. We could, then maybe we noticed that there was a problem and we decided to implement a solution like a restorative justice program. So we might monitor progress by seeing how have suspension rates varied for students by race or ethnicity in the 3 years since a district-wide restorative justice program was implemented. And we collect data on the discipline rates every year, and we kind of compare it across years. That lets us see if we're making progress towards a solution. It doesn't tell us necessarily why that change is happening. So the last thing we can do is evaluate a solution. And we could ask the question, to what extent does implementing a district-wide restorative justice program change suspension rates? That's going to be a more complex question to answer. So what we're going to focus on really is these first two kinds of questions we can answer, which are ones we can answer descriptively. And by descriptive, I mean, we're just describing the way some kind of phenomenon is, as opposed to explaining why it happened. When we're evaluating a solution, when we're doing this last thing, it's good to look at existing research or try to partner, if there's not existing research out there for it, to try and partner with researchers who are trained in conducting that kind of quantitative research, because that's often where we're going to be using something like an experiment, or get fancy and use quasi experiments, which is a whole thing, to kind of get at, actually, is there a program that's causing some kind of change in student outcomes? But we can do a lot with these first two questions, especially when it comes to advocacy. We don't always have to have this kind of causal evidence to do advocacy. It helps in some cases, but we don't always need it. So I feel like I've talked a lot. Are there any questions so far? Or anything that just seems like I could elaborate on? Okay, awesome. Well, we'll continue to move on. I learned as a teacher, you have to have wait time. You sit there for a while and you nod until someone responds. All right, so now let's talk about using that data. I'm going to talk a little bit about measures of central tendency, which is a fancy way of saying an average. So when these are the kinds of measurements we're often using when we're answering descriptive questions. We use means, medians, modes, averages. What a measure of central tendency does, it seems really simple, right? We're looking for the single best number to represent typical value in a set of data. The interesting part of what we're doing is we have all this data, right? We have all these numbers, and we're actually kind of throwing away a lot of information to get to that typical number. We've taken, we have 300 data points and we've turned it into one number. But that helps us examine patterns across groups, because we could take an average from one group and compare it to other groups, for example. Now, this probably goes back to math classes that you're either teaching or took a long time ago. When I was teaching this in my master's data analysis 1 class, and I asked them to describe each of these measurements. They said, mean's average, right? It's the one that we know. Median, it's just the one in the middle. We line everything up. We take the one in the middle. That's our median. And then mode is the one that shows up the most. I feel like we use mean a lot of the time, but I want to show you how this isn't always as straightforward. And sometimes these other kinds of averages, these other measures of central tendency, might get closer to what we want, or how all three of these can obscure really important information. So the whole thing seems pretty straightforward, right? Like we have test scores, let's say. And maybe this is an assignment that my students did in their data class on their weekly assignment. And we have, students got 83, 84, 84, 84, 85, 85, 85, 85, 85, 86, 86, 86, 87. Now, if we calculate the mean, median, mode for this, which I'm not going to ask you to do because it's early on a Saturday, in this case, they're all the same. They're all 85, right? So any of these kinds of averages that we try to use are going to give us the same typical value. But now let's just kind of add, let's say a student was really having a hard time and we add a 0 here. So we add this 0 and the mean is now different from the median and the mode. The mean is now 78.9, the median is an 85, and the mode is an 85. Now we have to make a decision, which is what is the most accurate reflection of the set of data? What is one number that represents the typical value? And that's not an easy question to answer because 85 is the most typical value, right? It shows up the most, it's right in the middle. But depending on what that 0 represents in the data, it really matters. If we erase that 0 from the data by using the median, we might be missing out on a student who's really struggling for a specific reason. This is why we also think about, when we do data analysis, variability and distributions. So behind every measure of central tendency, behind every average, is a distribution. Here I have a histogram, which is just showing us this same data, those same numbers, those same student test scores, and showing how frequently visually that they show up on the data. So you can see that 85 shows up about 5 times. I have a line that represents the median here and a line that represents the mean here, and they are both right here in the middle. And also, to get the mode, we just look at the tallest bar, right? And that'll give us the mode usually, here in this case, 85. Now, if we add the 0 to this distribution, notice that we have our median here at 85, and we have our mean here at 78.9. It's actually a value that doesn't even exist in the data, right? So the 78.9 is maybe not an accurate reflection of the numbers in this data. But also notice, like I said, there's a 0 here, right? And that 0 represents a person in the data. I think one thing that we do often when we're doing data analysis is we look at something like this 0 and we treat it as a problem in our data. We say, this is an outlier, it's pulling down our mean, and it's making our pretty story about a particular pattern confusing. But like I said, if these are students in my class who are doing assignments and I see this 0 and it's ruining my pretty data, so I ignore it, I'm also ignoring a student. So the kind of lesson here is we need to know not just averages, we need to understand how our data is distributed, because each of these observations represents a person or a school or a district or a state, and we miss out on important information by just only looking at the typical number. Now, I'm just going to get some, oh, I see something in the chat. I feel like we often ignore that data when we're looking at outcome data during a PLCs. We look at the kids who made proficient, ignore the kids who did not. That's exactly right, I think. That's the kind of issue, because we see like our average student's doing great, right? But then we have all these students who are maybe below proficiency level, but they're pulling down our averages. Oh no, we really need to be thoughtful about what these numbers mean.
And Francisco, if I could jump in one thing here too,
Yeah.
just I think about like sort of some of the forces at play that like create these kinds of situations. And for the fellows who are interested in pursuing or advocating for some kind of policy change, whether it's in your school district, or state, or some other level, the point of a policy, right, is to make a rule that applies to everybody. That's a policy, right? And so when you try to do that, what you try to do is you try to say, what's the thing that's going to work for, like, the everything or the typical situation. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it has these sort of consequences that if you ignore certain things, then you may actually wind up harming, not going as far as you would have liked to improve things. And so it's this very sort of delicate kind of balance of like, there's a reason we still use means and medians, but I think what Francisco's trying to remind us is just like, that's not the only thing we should be doing. Because that there's sort of like an interplay of forces here that people just have to be very mindful of.
Absolutely, fully agree. I'm not trying to tell you that means are bad. It's just there's always more to kind of dig into, and I think you all know that intuitively as teachers. You know, these are just different kinds of distributions. I love distributions. There's symmetric distributions. That's where your median and your mean are the same, right? And then kind of what I'm talking about here too are skewed distributions, right? We have outlier values, we have that 0, and it pulls the mean away from the median. And when you're looking at a skewed distribution, that's really when you need to be careful about actually like kind of digging in and seeing what's going on in the data. You know, I know sometimes in research, we just have quick fixes for that kind of thing, but it's always good to investigate what's going on. So, you know, that was a lot. What can we learn from this? Well, first, we just need to be careful about the measurement of central tendency that we use when we're describing data. Sometimes the mode is the most important thing. We want to know the most frequent experience. Sometimes the median is the most important thing. Sometimes the mean is the most important thing. It's just, we actually have to be critical about which one we're thinking about and using, and thinking about how that kind of fits in with the story that we're trying to tell in our advocacy. Also, behind every one of these averages is a distribution. Those distributions, when we look at them, sometimes they give us important information. So it's always worth looking at that distribution. That's usually the first thing I do when I get a set of data is I make a histogram and I look at how it's distributed, because that's going to tell me something interesting and important. And for these reasons, we need to be careful about the conclusions we draw from the numbers.
Oh, so that called Mr. Hilo. I forgot what I did. I did something like this. I was like,
Oh.
So let's look at an example. So this is, I pulled in some discipline data. I can show you kind of in one of those breakout sessions what this website looks like from the state of Tennessee. They have publicly available data on student discipline and a lot of other useful things. They're just like spreadsheets that you could download. And so I pulled that up, and I wanted to find out, how do suspension rates vary by students' race and ethnicity in Tennessee? And so before we answer that question, I want to kind of swerve a little bit and talk about using data critically. From the perspective of thinking about racial and ethnic categories, because this question is interrogating that specifically. So this kind of what I was talking about earlier, but this quote is from a review of this idea called QuantCrit, quantitative criticality, that's becoming very important, I think, in quantitative research. These authors, Gilborn, Warmington, DMAC, put together a really useful review for researchers. So they say there's nothing obvious, neutral, nor simple about education, statistics, and race. So people make decisions about what kinds of questions we're going to answer and how people are categorizing data. And those are often political decisions, or they're advocacy decisions, even when people aren't thinking about it, even when they're just kind of doing the status quo. So there's now this emerging field called QuantCrit, like I said, which challenges the assumption that quantitative data is always objective and that categories and data are natural. We often hold up quantitative analysis as objective. That's how people talk about it. But the quantitative data that's collected, how it's classified, and how it's analyzed, they're all human subjective decisions. And in the history of educational statistics, many of these tests and methods, analyses, were developed to reify racist ideas, to justify eugenics, to justify the exclusion of immigrant groups. Stephen Jay Gould's book, The Mismeasure of Man, is a really interesting dive into that. And so for that reason, when we're using quantitative data, we have to be critical. It's our responsibility to do that as advocates, as researchers. That is, when we decide to just be neutral, that's also a political choice to uphold the status quo. it's not just the natural thing to do. So they bring up 5 principles of quant crit that show up a lot in this research. The first is the idea of the centrality of racism, which is we're going to operate under the assumption in quantitative research that racism is central in American life and institutions. We're going to acknowledge that history. The second is the idea that numbers are not neutral, that numbers, they're collected and they're classified and they're the result of human judgment. They talk about categories, they're not natural nor given. They say for race, read racism. What they mean by that is that race as an idea was developed to exclude and dehumanize groups of people, and that we have to recognize that the categories that exist in data are a result of those social processes. The fourth, they say, is voice and insight. So data doesn't speak for itself. We have to lend our voice to data by attaching stories and narratives that are going to be necessarily subjective. When people say that they're talking about data objectively, that's a version of making a story and a narrative also. And then finally, they say to use numbers for social justice. So when we're doing quantitative research, we have a responsibility to aim our questions, our analyses, and then the stories or narratives that we attach to them towards social justice goals, especially given the racist and white supremacist history of the field of statistics. So thankfully, these ideas are starting to catch on in educational research, and people are being more thoughtful about how they use racial and ethnic categories. My next mission is to make it happen a lot more in data collection, so that people are collecting better data on race and ethnicity. So let's look at that discipline data. Let's look at the simple means, right? Oh, whoops. So we have, these are out of school suspension rates. That's a choice I made as a researcher. And that is just the share of students who are suspended out of school once. So this is what that number means. So this 4.89% means that about 5% of students in, I think this is data from 2 years ago, were suspended from school one time, at least in the school year. Now, also excluded in this data are schools where fewer than five students were categorized as Black, Hispanic, or white. And that's because the state suppresses that data to protect student privacy. So those schools are necessarily excluded. Also, the racial and ethnic identifications, where they come from forms kind of that parents fill out during registration. The state data, while people can kind of check off multiple races and ethnicities, they only allow for students to be classified as one race or ethnicity. And so they make classification choices at the Department of Education. So for example, a student who identifies as Hispanic and white is considered Hispanic. A student who identifies as Hispanic and Black is categorized as multiracial. So they make choices about these classifications that show up in these data. And finally, just a recognition that out-of-school suspension, it's not necessarily an indicator of student behavior, but the result of rules in the educational system and how they're deployed, right? So there's a lot of research showing that students are differentially disciplined for the same behavior based on the race ethnicity of the teacher and the race ethnicity of the student and how those two match. So what conclusions can we make from these findings? Does anyone want to just tell us the straightforward conclusion we might be able to make from this set of numbers?
Just a shot in the dark. It seems like that there are more African American Black students who are have been suspended once, but as to your point, the penalties and or the things that they were suspended for more would probably heavily weighted more so on who they are versus the technicality of what they did.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's a great way. How you explain that, I think, shows us the importance of not just saying the number, right? Not just saying like Black students are suspended at higher rates, but acknowledging what underlies that pattern, right? Because there's like the quote unquote objective way of saying it. Black students are suspended more. And people can take away a lot of conclusions from that. They're going to attach a story or narrative to that. And what you did was you provided the story or narrative for that based on, research, right? because people will, you know, make kind of poor conclusions from that. So
Yeah, one of the
yeah, go
biggest
ahead.
things, one of the biggest things that can be made, especially if I subscribe to racist ideology, is that Black students tend to get in more trouble than white students, and
Mhm.
it reinforces that stereotype.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's something also we have to be careful of when we're presenting statistics, right? We need to provide the narrative, provide the context like you just did, so that people understand that this isn't what we're not saying, oh, Black students get in more trouble because they are, you know, they're behaving more poorly at school. It's linking this up with other information that we have to say, actually, if we look at, you know, experimental research, we find that students that engage in the same behaviors are disciplined differently based on their race or ethnicity in schools, and that's a pattern that's really well documented. Now, if we dive in a bit more, we can actually look at the distributions here. So here, these are all histograms. What this is showing us is the out-of-school suspension rate in each school across Tennessee. And so you can see that most schools have a very low suspension rate, but this is a kind of right skewed distribution, meaning that there's all these kind of values out here, and the right, all these really high values, where there's actually really high out-of-school suspension rates at some schools. And then this line here represents the mean. Now, here, when we look at this, I kind of want to bring up a couple things, which is one, most schools have very low out-of-school suspension rates. This mean here is because we have a lot of schools also, you know, we have a lot of schools that have very high suspension rates. This is giving us information about how to target maybe a policy intervention, right? Say, well, look, most schools, low suspension rates. Why is that happening? And why do all of these schools have these egregiously high suspension rates? And then when we split these distributions out by race or ethnicity, we see the distribution for white students looks very similar to the just distribution for all students. Distribution for Black students, we can see like there's higher bars here and these kind of higher numbers. So that's kind of what's pulling up the mean for Black students, is there's these schools with 20% suspension rates for OSS suspension rates for Black students, with 40%, with 60%. And then also for Hispanic students, we can see that this zero bar is a lot higher, but there's still some schools that have pretty high values there. So this, like I said, tells us something a little bit different about the data, right? The means told us that Black students are suspended at the highest rates in the state. This tells us that there are schools where that is happening more than other schools. So maybe we need to see what's going on in those schools. And actually in those schools, that average is hiding actually was a really large problem. Because if 20% of Black students are getting suspended out of school once, that seems like a lot to me. So I want to show you one more way of looking at this, which is as a gap. So I made the choice to compare the rates within each school of Black students and white students who have been out of school suspended. And so here, what the negative numbers represent are schools where more white students are suspended than Black students, or a higher rate, sorry, of white students are suspended than Black students. And then up here above the zero are schools where Black students are suspended at higher rates than white students. And this is the average, saying that within schools, Black students tend to be suspended at higher rates than white students. And again, this gives us some different insight into this problem, right? It tells us there are schools where there's a 20, 30, almost 40% gap in suspension rates between white and Black students. So it's not that the schools are just suspending everyone more. It's that there's schools where there's a disproportionality in suspension by race or ethnicity. And this tells us we need to investigate what's happening in schools like this, right? Because there's some schools where there's no gap. these schools this might be obscuring something, that those schools are just suspending everyone a lot, and that's also bad. But this gives us kind of another set of insight into the problem. And so having gone through this, before I just talk about some places to find data, what kinds of conclusions could we make from these findings? I guess I just made a bunch of conclusions. And how do you think of these findings differently than the ones that you've looked at before? And what are just other questions that you have, or things that you wonder, or questions for me? Because I think I have like 10 minutes left before I turn things over to Peter.
So I have a question, because some of the inner city schools I've worked in, like it's almost dominantly Black. So like I would say 90% of the population are African American. How does that factor into the data?
Yeah, that's a great question, because what that's going to do two things, right? The first thing it's going to do is, let's say the school is 90% Black, 10% white. That's going to factor into these gaps a lot, because it might make a really, like, let's say like you're at a school where where this would obviously be a problem, where like white students, like one of them was suspended out of school once in the past school year, and then so that's like 1 out of 10, that's 10%. And then Black students, like you have many fewer maybe that are being suspended, or sorry, you have many more that are being suspended by a lower rate. Then that's going to produce maybe this gap here, these gaps on this side, and this might be schools where there's just not a lot of white students and a lot of Black students. So we'd have to investigate that. Also, when we're looking back here, this data is not gonna be an issue, right? Or this won't be an issue for this data, because we're looking at each student group individually instead of looking at the gaps. So we can see how often Black students are suspended in a school, how often white students are suspended in a school. But it might be, we'd probably want to investigate further, like if the schools that are all the way up here, it's because they have like 6 white students and 2 of them were suspended out of school. I see, let's see, I thought there'd be more Black students compared to white students. Interesting. And that is actually what we see here. If we get past this 0, in almost every, in most schools in Tennessee, the OSS rate gap is like Black students are being suspended at higher rates than white students. There are a few schools, or there's a smaller share of schools. This probably adds up to like 20%-ish, where there's more white students being suspended than Black students.
Francisco, one question I'm just wondering, because I know I want to sort of also acknowledge, like James shared a little bit of insight on some of the suspension patterns in Knox County, and I'm curious, and maybe this is something you do in consultancy later too, but just like how would you sort of further investigate that observation that James just provided about 16,000 kids, at least one suspension this year, 8,000 white students, 7,000 Black students in a population of 12. Like, just given what you just said here and how you think about these graphs, how would you sort of further investigate that sort of that observation?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing is that if we did this by county, Knox would then show up somewhere over here, right, on this distribution, because it seems like, just based on those numbers, that like Black students are being suspended at a much higher rate than white students. And that's gonna, you've diagnosed a problem with data, James. You have found a huge disproportionality in suspension rates. Now, I think then you end up with a lot of questions as to the why, right? And I think in Knox County, since you're looking at the county level, maybe the next step is thinking about which schools are those suspensions coming from and what's going on in those schools. Because the quantitative data can give us these rates. They can't tell us the inner workings of the school that are causing that. So I think that's the next step, is we need to go to these schools and kind of see why these disproportionalities are happening. Maybe it's like looking at the kinds of, you find in like some of the earlier research on disproportionalities in discipline rates by race or ethnicity, a lot of it is due to what they say are subjective infractions. So things like disrespect, things like that. And it's less like, there's not as much in disproportionality in things like fighting or something like that. It's more like things that teacher perceives, subjectively. And maybe then that if you find those same kinds of differences, maybe that points to a solution, right? We need to train teachers or hire teachers that are not going to be engaging in those kind of biases when they look at their students' behavior, right? Because that's going to tell me if I see like, Black students are getting suspended for subjective causes more often than white students. That's telling me like, I don't think that Black students are being disrespectful at a higher rate than white students. That's going to be probably something that's a perspective of the teacher and how they're perceiving student behavior.
So, can you hear me?
Yes,
I
James.
can hear you.
Okay. So they showed this data at our last principals meeting where we were doing a meeting on discipline. And the biggest infraction for suspension right now is fighting.
Mm-hmm.
But there were some around like silly stuff like tardy. Some students were being suspended over that and non-compliance and disruption of the school environment. But the major percentage, I want to say like 80% around there was fighting. But then that makes you ask the question, what's going on with the culture where students feel like they have to fight all the time?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Go ahead, Peter.
oh, I was just going to say, James, I think that, and James, I don't know your exact role. Sounds like if you were at a principal's meeting, you might be a principal. But I also, I think one thing as I was listening to Francisco sort of talk through how you investigate that, what I loved about it was it's based in the broad research, right? But that broad research also reflects the moments in time that research drew from, like just from, and this is more of a personal observation from just working on different projects, both inside the state and out and around the country, is like these things happen in a context, right? The incidence of fighting, right, would be an interesting thing to look backwards at too, if that data were available, because, to Francisco's point, what I loved about it is fighting, either there was a fight or there wasn't, is pretty kind of it, right? Maybe there's some interpretation and all of that, but like less room for interpretation there. And so then in my mind, it goes, well, okay, so how many fighting infractions were there? Do we even have the information with which to say anything about that? Which at least from the state's perspective, and Francisco, correct me if I'm wrong, because you've done this data way better than I have, but like, we don't get down to the level of this stuff at the state, but you might actually have it at the district level. And so there's a little bit of like, what's the context of what's happening here? Plus, at what level is this data being collected? Because again, if I were trying to say how's fighting going in Tennessee, I don't know why I would ever say that, but like the general, like I don't know that I could answer that question for you, but you might with Knox County data.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, and I think just what you're doing right now is exactly kind of the process we're talking about, which is like you've diagnosed a problem, you have data to think about, and now you have additional questions. And some of those questions are things that like I said, I can point to research that happened somewhere else that shows this pattern of subjective infractions. That might not be how it works in Knox County, And also, I think you're speaking to something else too, which is that like schools are a really complicated place. Like it's a mix of like the people that are in there and the decisions that they're making, and who's teaching, who's leading, et cetera. There's also just the context of what's going on around the schools, and that's always going to come into the schools. So like a school cannot alone absolve like social problems that exist outside of the school, even as much as we like to say that they can, and we try to do it, and we put all that pressure on schools. Schools are just one part of this like really large social context, and it's reflective of kind of what's going on outside. That's why when people say education is going to solve all of our problems, I'm very skeptical of that. Education is one thing that solves all of our problems, extremely important, but the things that happen outside of school are really important too, that people are taking care of, outside of school, that we as a society care about that. I also see
Francisco?
Dr. Oh, go ahead.
I was about to do exactly that.
Yeah,
Dr. Walker.
the question about disproportion or discipline discrepancies with Black girls in your research versus other races. Now, this isn't something I've specifically done research on. My research, I pulled the numbers from Tennessee, but I haven't done like really in-depth research on this stuff. There are other scholars that do that, and there are other scholars that look at Black girls specifically. And my sense is from that research, I haven't dug super deep into it, and I don't think that data exists. The Tennessee data, I don't think they have it by gender and race, that intersection. But my understanding is that disciplinary discrepancies, like that, girls are suspended generally at lower rates than boys. But that Black girls are suspended much more often than girls of other races or ethnicities, and that disproportionality is more extreme among girls than among boys. Like the gap between, this is my understanding, so I need to go back to the papers and make sure, but my understanding is that for like, if you were to compare like Black suspension rates for boys to white suspension rates for boys, they'd be closer. There'd still be a large gap, but they'd be closer than the suspension gap for white girls and Black girls, which is much larger, is my understanding of that. No problem. And I'm, you know, if you want to follow up with me, I can actually go, because I think I have like I have a million papers sitting in my hard drive that I've read, and I am like 80% sure that I have one readily available that you could, you know, take a look at. Moving on to just places to find data, and we can dive into this more because I know Peter's got a lot to share with you too. But these are just, from my perspective, 3 places where you can find some good data if you need to. One is just the state of Tennessee's website. That we'll send out this PowerPoint as a PDF, so you can. I'll make sure to send it to Julio so he can send it out to y'all. But there's just like a bunch of spreadsheets of data collected by the state. That's where I got all this discipline data. Like I literally just downloaded a spreadsheet, and then I used some software that I use for statistical analysis, and made all those charts. There's also the website for the Civil Rights Data Collection. That's federal, it's required by federal law that states and districts submit certain sets of data to the federal government, contingent, so that they can get their funding from the federal government. And the federal government compiles that data on this website. Tennessee is not super well represented in this data. Tennessee, I guess, has not always submitted everything that they are supposed to. So, you know, but you can maybe compare some things across states, and they have like tools on the website where you can make charts and stuff like that. So you don't have to worry about like using Excel or using some other kind of data analysis software. And then also there's the Urban Institute Data Explorer, which I love. They have just collected all of these federal data sets and stuff that would and census data that would otherwise be just like ridiculously complicated to put together. It would take hours and hours and hours to clean up and put together into a data set, and they just have it all. And you can just click what you want and download it, which is incredible. It saved me so much time. And that's their website there. They, like I said, have put together just a ton of fantastic data, including a lot of just federal data on schools. With that said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I am happy to, you know, if there's any more questions briefly for me, or if Peter wants to just jump right in, and I can monitor the chart for Peter, or monitor the chat.
And how much you like to
Happy to get started as soon as Julio gives me that screen sharing privilege. I might just say that
you should be able to screen share once now that Francisco's done.
Okay, cool. Oh yeah, thank you. That's it. Thank you. So one, I always appreciate, you guys can see this fine, right? We're good here. Slides, you can see the big one, goals.
Yep.
Okay, cool. I always appreciate having Francisco start this, because I think like really understanding the data and what one thinks about the data, broadly speaking, is actually one of the things that we don't get a lot of time to really reflect on. So many times it's like, I just want to do something with the data. I want to change something. I have to respond to something. And so really stepping back and interrogating these questions, I think, is the right way to start these kinds of conversations. And so this next part is kind of returning us back to what are more typical sort of situations you might find yourself in, where advocacy happens. And we start with all of that important interrogation because you don't want to wait until the moment of advocacy to decide, oh, shoot, I got to do all this work to really understand what I'm describing. That would be a setup for failure. So going to spend a little bit of time talking about that and a couple of goals here. One, for those of you who really like steps and frameworks and, how do I do this? We're going to just do a quick one that I think I found. I'm borrowing heavily from a colleague of mine that's been pretty effective for people just unpack, like, how do I do this? The second is talk about some examples of just how educator advocates can access and deploy data across a range of comfort levels, whether you're the allergic or the advocate or the analyzer or the whatever that strange phrase was that someone came up with. That's really cool. Should remember that. And then also some practical steps just to think about, like, how you can get more comfortable and to apply some of those important ideas that I think ideas and examples that Francisco elevated. And so, all right. So one thing I'll just start with at the top that I think you started hearing bits of inside the discussion with Francisco and the things that he said. I think he said it multiple times, right? Like, data is a part of the story in education, and it's the pairing of the story, a powerful story, which is its own sort of, like, I hope you guys get communications training or of some sort, because what does it mean to share a powerful story? Not covering that here today, but there are ways to do that. And then also the insightful data. And when you bring those two things together, that's probably some of the most powerful advocacy you can think of. In order to be able to do that well at the moment of delivering that sort of combo, building and maintaining trust is essential. And so, really making sure that people want that what you're bringing together is tested out, really thought about, really unpacked. The worst thing that I've seen done before is when someone says, why haven't you collected, why isn't there data on this? And it actually turns out there was. That's never a situation you want yourself to be in. Even though I will be the first to acknowledge there's a lot of limitations to what data is available today. And then finally, and part of this is, again, what Francisco got out of here too, is like, we just never had the education system where every student got the opportunities they deserve. That's just basically never existed before. And it's because of that reality, equity-driven advocacy really is a combination of your passion and your discipline. And the passion comes from the storytelling, and the discipline comes from the research and data. And again, that thought process that Francisco elevated is very much part of that discipline. And so let's move on to some of these steps kind of things, to the extent it's helpful for folks. And again, I want to give credit where credit is due. Bryce Warden, who's our director of policy at SCORE, came up with this framework. I am just using his stuff and to set this up and make it clear. So Francisco mentioned that we used quantitative data and research to diagnose a problem, monitor progress, evaluate a solution. In advocacy, we think of it as more like calling attention to an issue, informing others on progress, or advancing a solution. And so in that kind of a framework, you can, or when you think about that relationship, there's a couple of steps, right? Like, step one, the experience. Your advocacy begins with what your experience is. And I think in education advocacy in particular, teacher, educator perspectives are very powerful. Because they're very real. And people, all of us have gone to school in some way, but you're the one still doing the work that someone maybe 20 years or 30 years or 40 years removed from their personal experience. Even if you're a parent, you're not in that classroom every single day. The second is around exploration, right? And so this is really thinking about asking questions and finding answers with available data, which is, I think, even that what James shared with us early on. That's exactly, so clearly some data was found, but we're going to ask questions about it, and we're going to keep interrogating it to make sure that we really get closer and closer to something we can advocate on. And then third is really the explanation part. It's like really thinking about how you want to communicate your data for effective advocacy. So let me give you a few examples of how that might work. So as an example, you can call attention to an education issue here. In my experience, current practice does not support students learning to read. I think many of you probably feel that in some sort of way in the work you do every day. So in an exploration, I might start with what portion of students perform on grade level in English language arts in my school. Most of you probably know what that is. Let's just say hypothetically, it's 25.9%. When I go about explaining this, I'm going to start saying it more as like at my school, 1 in 4 students is on grade level in ELA. And so one thing I want to highlight here is like there's a difference between like that explore phase where you're really in the nuance of stuff, and then when you communicate that data, right? You could say 25.9%, or you could say 1 in 4. Much more conversational, much more sort of like, oh, okay, 1 of every 4 kids. I get that. 25.9% can feel a little scary to people. Numbers, as a general principle, unfortunately, I think a lot of people just struggle with that level of specificity because they don't live in that specificity. And we're trying to inform others about a topic. An experience I might have is community stakeholders are unaware of the different student backgrounds present at my school. So what are the demographics of the students at my school? So in front of you, I could say 53% white, 14.8% black, 26.5% Latino, 11.5% English learners. When I go out there and explain it, I might say in my school, about half the students are white and the remaining half are students of color. 1 in 10 students is an English learner. Now, let me be very clear here, right? Like when we just had a conversation about how important it is to disaggregate something, to investigate something. But at the moment that we're having to explain it to someone, particularly if it's someone who's not familiar with your situation, some degree of simplification comes back together again. That's that sort of balance of like when you're doing the research and doing the communication of the advocacy. And again, these are different types of calls you can make depending on who it is you're talking to and what is the purpose of what you're doing. But if I were to assume that the person I'm talking to does not actually know much about the school that I'm trying to talk about, I may make some simplifications just to make sure I communicate the most important things. I work in a pretty diverse school is the message I really want that person to know. And finally, around sourcing policy solutions, really thinking about, here's an example. Tennessee Promise encourages my students to persist from their first to second year in college. A question I might explore is how much more likely are Promise students to continue in college? From the Tennessee Promise annual report, we found that 62.6% of Promise students retained from year 1 to year 2. And then when I explain it, the Tennessee Promise retention rate is higher than the average retention rate, 57.9 for Tennessee community colleges. The thing I'm trying to communicate is it's higher, right? Now, even within that, if you really ask people who think about post-secondary success, why someone goes to, stays in, and completes college, there's a lot of forces in there. So I would not say this is the definitive answer. But from what I can observe, Promise students are being retained at a higher than the average retention rate. And so again, I start with the observation and experience. I explore what's underneath it, and then I explain it in a way that is pretty compelling. So I'm going to take a moment and just sort of share an example from my own personal advocacy when I was an educator. And I'm going to center it on a body of work that I think was very hot 10 years ago. I suspect is still hot today, is around the identification of highly effective teachers, right? When I started teaching in Memphis, we were a couple of observations I'd share from a policy context with you. One is for those who've been in teaching, in particular in Tennessee for more than a decade, we used to evaluate folks once every 5 to 10 years. And if you think about what we do today, it's quite a bit more than that. And you can debate how much more or how much is needed, but I think we can all agree that once every 5 years is probably not enough. And at the time, as an educator, I didn't think about it like that, like, oh, how many years, what it ought to be. What I saw was in my first year of teaching, and let me be very clear here, just like every first year teacher struggled with classroom management, struggled with what I was going to do with curriculum. So I would not say at all that I was, the best teacher. But the thing that really killed me in my first year teaching was I had a student who was in the 11th grade, had an IEP, but could not read at all. And I used to really sit with that for a second and go, so a student went through 11 years of school and for whatever reason, just never learned to read. And in my mind, whenever I was talking about, you know, like, wow, like did 11 English teachers walk by and did not do something? Now, again, reading's a complex task, and we're not saying it's all about the teacher, but at the time, I think one of the things that I wondered was like, well, if it was the case that, you know, teachers weren't even having a conversation about their instructional practice more than once every 5 years, I mean, that's a black box of instruction that we just don't have any insights into or any sort of ability to hold anyone accountable. And so I would share this story with policymakers, you know, with other teachers, with district officials, and I probably centered mostly on sort of just exactly what I saw in the classroom, right? Because that's what I had. What I would do today now, if I were to share that same story though, if I were to use this sort of experience, explore, explain framework, is I would do a little bit more investigation as to that, like what is it that we know about classroom practice that can act and sort of teacher effectiveness to help advance why teacher evaluation may be a good thing to advance quality teaching and learning. And so I might start with that. I'll still start with that observation, right? I think it's probably important that we go and see teacher practice and understand how teachers are doing every year, maybe even a few times a year. Give you the story of that student that I mentioned. But now I might actually use some data from our Tennessee Educator Survey, which over a period of, you know, almost 10, there's probably a newer graph to be made here, but the general point is the Tennessee Educator Survey, if you've not explored that data before, by the way, is probably one of the best teacher perception surveys in the entire country. And Francisco can tell you, and yeah, he's looked. And one of the questions that the Tennessee Educator Survey asks is, you know, do they believe that teacher evaluation supports better teaching and better student learning? Yes, please fill it out. And over from the moment we started, it started really, really low. People did not believe that. Teachers did not believe that. And over time, more than almost like 3/4 of teachers believe that it did both of those things. That's a pretty high standard of support that says, hey, this is actually the right thing to do and it's going to help things get better. That's the kind of stuff I would probably still use today if I was still in the classroom, because it's very clear teachers support this, right? Then you get into sort of what Francisco was getting at, which is that there are also researchers who are studying, did it actually improve teacher learning, teachers teaching and student learning? Turns out it did too. And so in a package where I would explain and try to support, you know, the use of a multiple measure evaluation system for educators, I would be able to use both a story that said, hey, you know, we went from a system of once every 5 years and kind of saw what happened, to teachers are now 3/4 of whom believe that the evaluation system supports better teaching, better learning, all the way to, hey, it also looks like it actually improves actual student learning. That's a pretty sort of set package right there of insights if I was trying to advance and advocate for a multiple measure evaluation system. And so that's the framework: experience, explore, explain. And again, if that's a helpful framework for you, do that. We're going to dive into a little bit of that second step of explore coming up next. And so, and happy to sort of get into these frameworks or questions if that's helpful to you in consultancies. So we kind of got into some of this before, but at the highest level of sort of thinking about, as an educator, how to deploy data exploration and the data itself, there's really generally sort of 3 strategies here. One, you use other people's work. You rely on something that's high quality, credible, you know, whatever Francisco writes, basically, right? Like, use that stuff, but there's a lot of places to draw on that. We'll talk a little about the first one. The second is to add on to that with an additional insight. So this is kind of what James got us to. There's like, here's what the out of school suspension rates look like across the state. Here's what I heard in a principals meeting with my own district's data that confirms and further develops that point. And then do your own. Do your own could be like, you know, maybe you actually poll a group of principals about, you know, some perceptions of that data. You could also make literally go into your school's discipline codes. Exactly how you would do that, I'd be careful. Make sure you talk to the right folks. But that is a possible path to get even more granular about what exactly it is the problem. But no matter which pathway you choose, just remember that the more specific your situation, the more work it's going to take. Data analysis, as Francisco covered, is a pretty it's like its own sort of body of work, and there are whole jobs dedicated to this stuff, right? And so that's fine if you want to do that, but if you're also like, I'm an educator, I want to be with the kids and all that, like, you're probably not, unless you got literally nothing else to do, going to have all the time in the world to dig into every single data that you want. And so what you're negotiating here is the balance of like, how do I use data to make a general point, do enough work to get it specific enough to my situation so that then you can advance your advocacy. An example of this from our work at SCORE, we've known for a long time that our education system hasn't worked for low-income kids. One of the core challenges is you would think that there was some kind of system where you could like track every single kid from like early childhood through pre-K, through K-12, through higher education, through workforce, and that you'd literally have a single code and just be able to like watch it all happen all at once for all the 100 million kids that we have in the public education system. Turns out there isn't. And so what we've had to do, and we were focused more on the sort of high school to workforce pipeline, was really think about breaking down the steps and doing some of our own estimates based on a whole bunch of information from a whole bunch of different places. Start High School is our high school enrollment data. So I'm looking on the right, the screen in front of you, the right side of the slide. Graduation rate from high school is TDOE data. Enroll in college comes from our Higher Education Commission. Return for a second year, also Higher Education Commission. Graduate in 6, Higher Education. But like, these are two different, and they're not all in the same sheet either. They're all kind of like in different places and having to make some estimates as to how a low-income student gets from starting high school to the very to graduating college. I want to come back for a second to Dr. Welch's question about being a pre-K teacher and having that sort of top-down pressure of talking about fifth grade. The sort of only people care about sort of the fifth grade situation. And I think the broader point is in education, we often have to think about limitations of data. Like the whole cycle is kind of like repetitive a little bit because we have a lot of information on K-12 students. The further along you go up into like early childhood, pre-K, you start getting a little crunch, like it gets a little cloudier or more cloudy rather, because like like if you think about also just what we know from a pre-K student before they entered pre-K, that's a lot of home or childcare situations for which we have very limited information about. It's not because someone didn't collect it. It's just the nature of how those programs work. And so thinking about these kinds of like across the barrier issues is really important. I think inside a school, it's fine. The fourth grade teacher needs to just talk to the third grade teacher and get that data. That's one thing. But when you cross the boundary of another school, I bet for those of you who teach in 5th and 6th grades, there's probably an interesting like elementary school to middle school transition kind of data. If you wanted to say something about how kids are successful or not successful, all these kinds of boundary issues get created when you want to advocate or do something about the transition barrier. But Dr. Welch, happy to dig in that further at the end of this too. But I think that's what we learned when we tried to really think about advocating for something that works better for our low-income students in Tennessee. building from that, things that you could do, right? Especially as you think about like recovering from COVID-19 in the midst of that research, you could think about, you know, especially given the impact that COVID has had on learning generally. If you know that even before the pandemic, it wasn't working very well for a whole group of students, you can imagine what the pandemic did. And so some things, some ways to think about like, okay, so who's the level that I'm talking to right now? If I was a teacher, and so I'm doing school level advocacy, I might say, you know, we really need to focus on our school's re-engagement opportunities, you know, things like high dosage tutoring, summer learning, social worker supports on the 30 kids in the building who we know didn't show up really much at all for formal schooling last year because of COVID disruptions. If I was trying to talk to a district official or a school board member, we need the community to lean in with wraparound supports so that we decrease our chronic absenteeism rate, right? That's a way to describe, hey, there were a lot of kids who missed a lot of school during COVID. When it comes to state level advocacy, you could imagine investing additional funds to help students along a multi-year recovery, given the disrupted education so many students face, particularly since our economically disadvantaged students had a chronic absenteeism rate more than 2.5 times higher than their non-economically disadvantaged peers. So those are the ways you could think about using certain data points at the different levels that you might advocate. There's also, you know, in addition to data, some of this is like from before we had better data. We have much better data now than what I'm showing you, but it's still like being prepared. But in addition to data, like you can also think about like a project we took on at SCORE was, what is the experience of students who are about to go to college? Like there were some, we as a state have had a pretty massive drop in the college going rate as a result, partly as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we just straight up went and asked people. We asked kids, like we asked students, like what was it like to do that? And there's a little a bit of a write-up here that really gets at that. And that in itself is also a further form of data that started actually from another analysis, right? Of the system before wasn't working for kids. I talked a little bit about chronic absenteeism. Here's the actual experience of how it actually works. Again, there's a lot of different pieces of information that we're putting together to say, hey, we need to do something different as a result of the COVID pandemic for kids, whatever the problem is, right? If you want to go really big and you want to get really, and really talk about all kinds of things or really specific, to Francisco's point, there's a whole data downloads sheet on TDEWE that you can go as specific as you want. You want to nerd out in Excel, you do your own analysis. We are a very data rich state, especially when it comes to publicly accessible data. That does not mean, I do not want to say it, I do not want to give you the impression that we've got all the data that you would ever need. That literally doesn't exist. But compared to everybody else around the country, we actually do a decent job of publicly sharing data sheets so that if you wanted a question that you wanted to answer, you had a decent chance you could answer it. I'm going to skip the school finance stuff because I think I'm a little over on time. Because I'm going to talk to you about TISA, which has been the work I've been doing for the last 2 years. But I'll just very quickly say that, like, for me, thinking about the things of like what I experienced in the classroom, like you can go from a story to some survey data that other people did and use that, sourcing research on the system that you advocate for, or you can dream up whole other solutions, which for me was actually working on school finance. That is the one of the craziest forms of data advocacy, because you have to know how the money goes into schools and how do we target all of these kinds of things. And again, that's of interest to you. That's its own body of work. But that doesn't mean that everyone has to do that. I think it's actually really important to just kind of stay focused on there are ways to do this as an educator that are also incredibly powerful, that are not the ways that Francisco and I would do it. And so that experience bit that you bring, the exploration of data that you can do with some of the steps here, and then really getting disciplined about how one explains that and really thinks about audience, message, succinctness, and all of that. So a couple of practical steps before we go into consultancies. Things that you could do right now as you build the skill set to do this. One, the easiest one is reading the right stuff. And that's and I would point you particularly to newspapers, credible newspapers, and what we call trade publications. So Education Week, Chalkbeat, because a lot of the writers for those organizations talk to people like me, like Francisco, like Ed Trust, like all the other organizations, like Diaries, right? Because we do the research, we do the analysis, and then they actually are communicating to you in very succinct, because that's literally their job, right? It's to write in a way that makes sense. And when they use that data, that's the stuff you should be grabbing, right? And the more you read it, the more you'll develop a familiarity of what's out there, what the numbers look like. And then over time, it'll just get better and better and better about the questions and the insights you can bring to bear. A couple of folks, I know I've got a few, and I'm sure I can share this later, but the one guy I would definitely call out for you, because it's a data workshop, is Matt Barnum. That guy at Chalkbeat, he's like a gift to our field. That guy translates research like nobody's business. And on Twitter, if you ever follow him, when he calls out some kind of data point, ooh, it's gonna be some fireworks over there, because he really actually does read this stuff. Talked a little bit about this already, but again, the whole bunch of data sets that are available. I also want to do a special call out to our friends in Nashville, Metro Nashville, Memphis, Shelby County Schools, and Knox County. You all work in districts that actually have a research team that actually publish their research on their websites. If you didn't know that, make sure you go check out those websites and see what they've looked at. They might not have studied exactly what you want them to study, but there's actually a lot of granularity in and their purpose is to evaluate district initiatives, which may not necessarily be the same things that you're interested in, but oftentimes can be, because if in a well-functioning district, they're solving problems that teachers are identifying. And then the third step of this is just the full range of sort of data-related advocacy. You can use data insights to really add urgency to a challenge, motivate action, gain support for an idea, or this one always gets a little not enough attention, but defending something. I know a lot of times, something is working and it actually needs defense. That's advocacy too. And then the things that we've covered in different parts of this conversation, asking for more data is actually probably one of the most powerful acts of equity-driven advocacy, because disaggregation, as Francisco mentioned to you, super important. Collecting new data. Not all data that we want exists. Sometimes it's got to go get collected. Francisco mentioned he's already working on something like that. And then connecting multiple pieces of information, that's a difficult one too. But all of these things are asks that you can make related to data. Yeah, so I think that's the basic summary here. If you need a framework, experience, explore, explain. When you're doing some of the exploration, you can use other people's work, you can add to others, or you can do your own. And then in practical ways to grow, read a bunch, familiarize yourself with your own state or district's data, and then really know the range of data-related advocacy you can do. So I'll stop here, and I think we're gonna move on to some consultancies and fun conversation.
All right, I've got the breakout rooms ready, Peter. I can send them now if you guys are ready.
Francisco, anything you want to say before we go?
Oh, well, I shared in the chat. I'd be remiss if I didn't plug the work of Tara, because some of it is work that I do. And my advisor is the faculty director of Tara. But Tara has a lot of good briefs there that are written more for a general audience than like the academic articles that are written basically for no one. So it's always worth going there for some Tennessee specific research. There's some good COVID related research too from a large project that we worked on. Some really interesting stuff there. And yeah, I think I hope that Peter, I always enjoy hearing Peter because he comes from a different perspective too than I do, because he's more in the getting his hands dirty, and I'm sitting in front of a computer. I really appreciate hearing kind of the way that you do advocacy there. And then also, in addition to that, is, the further that people like Peter and I get away from being in the classroom, the less we really understand the experience. And that's why it's just, I think, incredible and important that y'all are doing this work. And I'd just like to thank you for taking your Saturday when you're teaching, which is the hardest job in the world, to do this.
So I think we're gonna have like maybe 20, 25 minutes. We'll come back at 11:55, right? Or 11:55 Central Time, because I know there's a bunch of folks out east.
Yeah.
And we'll come back for a very short sort of like, what did we learn conversation here. But in our consultancies, I believe we're each gonna handle this pretty similarly. It's like we have some things we could do, but also it's kind of like a ask what an AMA, ask me anything. So yeah, so Julio, if we're good to go, I think Francisco, you good?
Yep, absolutely.
Yep, I'm sending y'all now. Hi, Alicia, Moniqua, Anita, and Alexis. You can go ahead and go to your breakout rooms with Peter or Francisco, please. All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you've all had a good break, good lunch, and looking forward to this data panel, which I'm very excited about. We've got some great guests with us. You all read their professional bios this week. I'm going to introduce them, and then when I say your name, if you want to give any additional context to who you are, maybe share something you're excited about doing over this fall break period, and then we'll get started with our conversation. So first off, we got Fariha Hussein, who is an MPP candidate at Vanderbilt University's Peabody College, who spent some time with Ed Trust this summer, wrote a report for TECA, and is working on some more work that we'll continue to keep an eye on. And Fariha, welcome. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you guys for having me. Excited to talk and have this conversation, get to know you guys a little better.
Next, we have Alexis Parker, who is the Senior Data and Research Analyst at Tennessee SCORE. We heard from Peter Tang this morning, so we'll get to hear more about the data from Alexis this afternoon. Someone who is a close friend of mine. We worked together at SCORE just about 6 months ago. Alexis, good afternoon. Good to see you.
Thanks, Julio. Really excited for the opportunity to chat with you all today and share a little bit about data. Thanks.
And last, but certainly not least, we have Dr. James Thompson, PhD, who is Associate Dean, Professor. This bio is too long for the page, so I had to cut it down, but who is a great person from Austin Peay State University joining us today. Dr. Thompson, thanks for being here today.
Hey, Julio, thank you so much. And thank you for being here today. I just want to lead with just one thing. You said what we're going to do fun for fall break. I'm going to show you what's fun. This is fun. I have my wife and my 3 kids, and they are my life. And so we actually, we're on the road traveling back to our home state of South Carolina. I forgot all about, we had to do this panel today. I wouldn't miss it for anything. So thank you again. And I'm looking forward to fall break and sharing a little bit about data. Thank you.
That's so great. We at TECA love bringing our full selves, our families. And hopefully you, South Carolina, have a good game day today. Haven't checked any scores today, but I'll be interested in the Vanderbilt game that starts here in about 2 hours. Again, thanks to all 3 of you for being our guests this afternoon. And I'm going to get started here right away. And for all of our fellows, if you have any questions during the conversation, pop them into the chat, raise your hand. We will have time for a Q&A at the end once we go through our questions. But feel free to pop anything into the chat as we come to it. But Dr. Thompson, I'll start with you. And just tell us a little bit more about the work that you do and the road that got you into higher education and into this space.
Absolutely. Julio, I started my profession in education, K-12, back in 2002. I started off as a 7th grade science teacher in the beautiful state of South Carolina. I didn't go to school to be a teacher. I went to school to be a medical doctor. That didn't happen. God has a sense of humor. So at the age of 26, I fell into the journey of becoming a school teacher. I was in denial for 2 years from the age of 24 and 26. Everybody told me that's your calling. You're going to be a teacher one day. I said, oh no, teachers are underpaid. But I'm a living testimony that if you're good at what you do, and I'm not bragging on what I do, but if you're good at what you do, the money will chase you down, and you have many opportunities to make decent pay in this profession. So I started off in 2002, 7th grade science teacher. Taught for exactly 3.5 years. After 3.5 years, I went into the district office to oversee a $2.6 million grant, Europe grant. I did that for exactly 1 year, but I felt like I was missing something. I wanted to go back to the classroom, but I knew I wasn't able to go back into the classroom in a small rural school district in South Carolina. So I decided to work my PhD at the University of Southern Mississippi. Knocked that out by 2008. I had many more opportunities in the school district. Served as an advanced placement science coordinator, did that for a couple of years. Went from there to become an assistant principal over curriculum and instruction, and start really dabbling into data. Why? Because I was one of the first man of color to become an assistant principal at this middle school in Columbia, South Carolina, which is my home city. But I did not realize at the time that this middle school never had a black male serve as an assistant principal. When I went there, I was charged with how can we turn around our African American young men. And so you can't turn anything around unless you really know the data, right? And so I started looking at the data. I started putting my finger on what we can change, what can we control. And I started having data meetings with my teacher. And we would do that maybe once a week. I would go from grade level 6 through 8, having candid conversations, talking about race, talking about demographics, talking about their comfort level, talking about what can they do in the classroom, what can they control. So that's really my journey in K-12, moving into data. From there, I love research. I love research so much that I decided that I wanted to leave K-12 permanently, and I became an assistant professor on a non-tenure track at Alabama A&M University. This is prior to COVID. So January 2020, did that for several months, got promoted to director of accreditation assessment, again, going back into data. Did that, but at the same time, Austin Peay State University had an opportunity to open up to be a tenure track at AP. I did that and just got promoted last year to associate dean, and now so I'm an associate dean over assessment or accreditation, and as well as equity. So data is what I use every day to make good, sound decisions. I know you have a question later about something about data when it's not good. You lean on data. I don't believe in that. I believe you should always lean on data, and also believe that data should always tell the truth. Some people don't want to hear the truth, but I like to tell people the truth and support data. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and we'll certainly dive into, you heard a little bit about that this morning with Peter and Francisco, so you were ending the conversation, but we'll get into data usage and how it paints a story, how it can retell a story a lot of times. So thanks for bringing that up, and we'll for sure dive into that. Freya, I'll turn to you and kind of same question. Just tell us a little bit about what brought you to your MPP program at Peabody, your work at Trust, and why you think about data in the education space.
Totally. So actually, similarly enough, I went to college to be pre-med or pre-dental. I have a biology degree, but my college transcript is very much like 50% of it is science stuff, 50% of it is youth development. Like I had a minor in the School of Social Work, the School of Public Health, or I was constantly finding ways to like volunteer or work in classrooms through school and classes. And so ultimately I graduated and I knew that's what I wanted to do. So I pursued graduate school in like secondary science education. And I taught at a project-based learning school. It was a smaller magnet school in Columbus, Indiana. And it was a good, like, I loved it very much. It was the ideal, I think, dream situation for a teacher. And I got to teach science and English because of the way that our school was structured. We had some flexibility in how we organized our classes. And so I had a co-teacher that taught English. And I think that opportunity really helped me to see how I could use science skills in classes that were not just like science specific. And so we were in an English class, but still doing science experiments and using data and collecting data and things like that. And so I think that really just showed me in general, like how valuable data is for sure. And then ultimately what led me to my master's in public policy at Vanderbilt in education policy is I began doing policy work on a district level for my district. I was one of probably 4% teachers of color in a district that was 40% students of color. And so there were just things that would happen in the classroom that I was acutely aware of that other teachers in my school or in my district didn't know. And I'm Muslim, and so I was really tuned into like the Muslim population in that community. And so I would have students from like various schools throughout our district come to me and say, I'm struggling because of this teacher or someone bullying me in this classroom. And I was able to advocate for students by reaching out to principals or like talking to parents, doing whatever I needed to do in my school and outside of my school. So I began working with my superintendent's office on developing policies related to restorative justice in our schools, uniform, like making that uniform across the district, and also developing policies related to like underrepresented teacher recruitment and retainment. And so it was really important work, but I felt limited in what we were doing on a district level, and we have larger systemic changes that need to be made. So I think that's what really brought me to my MPP. And I think now that I'm here, I've really just learned that data is sometimes what we have to use to push our, not push, but like to promote our ideas, to really back up and validate these experiences that so many of us know that we have to use data to back it up, because that's how some people see it. And so grateful for the work that I have had the opportunity to do with EdTrust and with TECA. Really, that relationship just happened because I got to Nashville and I was like, I want to do equity work. I want to do work like for students of color and teachers of color and people that are marginalized and underrepresented. And people just kept pushing me toward both TECA and EdTrust. So I think similar to what Dr. Thompson said, like doors just open when you know what you care about and when you're consistent in the things that you do. Yep.
Thank you so much. And again, we'll dive into this as well. Equity, you're both segueing the rest of the conversation super well. So Priya, thank you. And then Alexis, same question to you. What brought you to this education data work and why SCORE?
Yeah, absolutely. So I initially, just like my fellow panelists, of course, went into college thinking I was going to be pre-med, but specifically wanted to be an occupational therapist and get my OTD, work with students with disabilities, and really focus on that population and their unique needs in the classroom, kind of outside of the traditional learning space, and had the opportunity to actually shadow an occupational therapist in a specialty school that serves students low functioning, high functioning on the spectrum. And through that opportunity, you know, while working with the students was great and I really loved that, I just kept kind of getting drawn to these much larger systemic issues at the school. The classroom that I was working in did not have a certified teacher. It was just several different teachers' aides kind of cobbling together curriculum for the kids. And, you know, I just started thinking about all of these much larger issues and equity problems facing these students, and was like, okay, let's completely change what I'm doing, change the pathway. I want to go into education and specifically get into education policy. Like Fariha, ended up going into the MPP program at Vanderbilt. And during that time is actually when I started at SCORE. So I started out as a graduate fellow while I was completing my master's of public policy. And that is really when I got into the data space. Initially, wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, thought maybe I wanted to do educator engagement, policy work, and then thankfully at SCORE, they really were able to cultivate my data skills and kind of identify that I had an aptitude for it. Didn't realize that most kids didn't play in Microsoft Excel for fun as children, and that was me. So I think it was a really great opportunity to kind of continue to build on those skills. And now I am SCORE's senior data and research analyst. I am a small but mighty team of one, kind of doing everything from data monitoring and collection to analysis, visualization, working kind of on all our reports, making sure that basically all of the work that we do is very data driven, and also supporting our partners who may have lower capacity, be a smaller startup organization and not have a data team. So supporting them to make sure that they're aware of really key trends, key takeaways across a lot of the major data that is released in our state. And it's just been a great time so far, and I'm really passionate about the data work that we do and making sure that the education space in Tennessee in particular continues to be very data driven.
Well, that's a great segue, Alexis, into our next question of kind of diving deeper into how you use data in education policy work and education advocacy work at your organization, and really dive into what data tells you in education. And I'll let you start off that, and Fariha and Dr. Thompson will dive into that as well.
Perfect. So SCORE, if you're not familiar, is really an advocacy organization. So across all the work I do, I'm thinking about data through an advocacy lens and how it can support our overall strategy towards making policy change, towards supporting our partners. So for me, I have 4 main goals in how I use data at my organization. So the first would be to create urgency or motivate action. So that would be highlighting really critical data, like, for example, the 3rd grade literacy rates in our state, and highlighting that data and really bringing a light on that is what helps support SCORE and other partners to pass the large literacy package that happened a couple of years ago. So that's kind of the first one, is really to motivate action. And the second would be to encourage expansion. So when we know a program's working, how can we use data to let people know, hey, this is working, let's continue to spread this program across our state. So for example, summer bridge programs for students coming out of high school and transitioning into college is a really effective method to make sure those students can transition successfully. And Tennessee Achieves, a partner organization in our state, has some really strong data to show that, and we've been able to highlight that data to help expand those bridge programs. Another key goal is to support implementation. So using data and research to make sure that the programs that we're putting in place in the classroom are actually implemented in a highly effective way. So for example, right now we're doing a ton of high dosage tutoring work. And my role at SCORE has really been to make sure that as we're working with districts who are implementing these tutoring programs, letting them know, hey, the research says it has to be this long with this ratio, this many days a week, making sure they have the data and the research on how best to implement those programs so they actually show results for students. And then finally, data to understand impact. So when we have kind of these landmark policies like the implementation of Tennessee Promise in the state, we can really use data to understand what the impact of those programs are. And that way we can see, okay, it's working really well for this population. Maybe here it has a weakness, and we can actually iterate and improve on some of those policies to make sure they're continually strong and continually serving our student populations really, really well.
Thanks,
All right,
Lexi. Yeah, Dr. Thompson, please, your question.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Julio. 2 primary roles for data for us. When we start a brand new academic year, we always ask for our professors. They work in small teams. We always ask for the annual performance review, and the APR is based on the student learning outcomes. The student learning outcomes should be aligned with the key assessment or the end of course exam. And the reason I always ask our professors to put together to complete that APR is because I want to know whether or not our students are being successful in the classroom, whether or not they're meeting the student learning outcomes. And the student learning outcomes should also be aligned with the practice test. So being a teaching aid program, our biggest thing is whether or not we're going to get our students from being freshmen to graduating at the finish line. And a student can graduate, but the student doesn't pass the practice test, I mean, we failed that student, right? So it's not just a teacher prep program, but it's also for the principal prep program as well. And that's the program I primarily teach in, the master level, master of ed and leadership, and also in the EDD program. But what I've noticed is that being intentional and designing courses with good student learning outcomes and ensuring that our tests are aligned with the practice, our students are doing so much better on the practice test. And that's the ultimate test. But then when we move up and look at the data with our EDD program, how do we know whether or not a doc student is successful? A doc student is successful is when he or she is able to successfully defend his or her dissertation. So if we're having writing problems early on and we don't catch it, plagiarism, APA citations, or anything, if we don't catch it early on, then we failed that student. And so we collect data. We don't just wait to like certain benchmarks or wait to the end of the course or wait to the end of the program. We're monitoring, Alexis said this earlier, we're monitoring all along. And by doing and collecting data all along, it makes it so much easier to help guide and help the student navigate our program. So we're looking at data like constantly throughout each program.
And Fariha, same question of how you use that education data deeply and now in your MPP as you're thinking about it into your next steps, but at Trust, the work you do with TECA, and how that informs your policy and advocacy.
Yeah, for sure. So in my time with EdTrust, I was there from January until like into September. And so I supported a few different types of policy or parts of our organization and the work that we did. And specifically like during legislative session, for example, that required a lot of bill analysis. So we would take a look at various bills related to education and then think about the potential implications of these bills. And a lot of times that required like doing research and like digging into academic data and research and really looking at like what % of students are potentially, like what does the data say about student experiences if we create these types of learning environments for them. And so in that sense, and also like in that report that TECA and EdTrust published together, data is really helpful in really providing the evidence for any stance that we take. So for example, in the report that we published, if we are providing the recommendation of, like teacher candidates of color at EPPs, so at schools of education really need mentorship programs, data is really important to validate and prove that, candidates are feeling isolated, and that's why they need that mentorship. And so it really takes just stories, I think, and it grounds them in reality that's tangible for certain people, and it provides drive and incentive to create change. Because I feel like it can be hard maybe to think that, if we do this or this will change someone's lived experience. But I think maybe people are motivated a little bit when they see actual data and statistics and research, and they're like, okay, well, here's a gap and here's a way that we could close them. It helps to set goals as well. And so I think that data is definitely prioritized because it's how we use, like how we analyze and provide those recommendations. And I think it's prioritized because it's the most powerful way to really draw people together when you have shared data and research that people can learn from and then set goals on together.
So again, y'all are knocking it out of the park because that segues great into our next question. And Freya, I'll let you continue talking. All three of you are doing this work in Tennessee. Obviously, TECA and our educators are all in Tennessee. So my first question is, what are the significant data challenges in the state? What issues do you see of transparency, clarity, access? I know, Alexis, you'll talk a lot about access. And then what your organization is doing to address these challenges.
Yeah, so I think one of the primary challenges to data is that while a lot of people in the advocacy space can agree that it's important, I think the way that it's collected varies based on organization. And I think that some of the data that we would like to have just isn't necessarily available. For example, I remember talking to Diarese earlier this year about demographics of teachers of color in Tennessee, and just the fact that like that isn't data, that's not information that's collected by all school districts across the board. And so that's not necessarily data that we can accurately capture on a state level, like across the board as well. And so I think that in terms of challenges, really, sometimes the questions that we're asking, we don't have accessible data to those answers. So there are ways to like try to find similar ideas or really think about how to take the data we have and like see if there's a way to work with it, but really disaggregating data sometimes by race or ethnicity, or looking at intersectionality between race and ethnicity and like students with learning disabilities, like that can be challenging to find. However, I think that that's sort of the role of a lot of these advocacy organizations to say, well, we need this data because we want to create change and we want to improve the lives of these people and these students. And so I think the first step to addressing that transparency and clarity and access is really just by making sure that our voices are heard as people who want to access and use this data.
Dr. Tom or Alexis, yeah, go ahead.
Perfect. Yeah, just I would give a big +1 to that. I think the disaggregation issue in particular is really tough. And obviously that gets into student privacy and all of those things, but I think it's even just like in how we have written policies in this state. In our ESSA plan, which is like our federal mandated plan, we say that we disaggregate data as BHN, which is Black, Hispanic, Native American. So even in how we're disaggregating students, we're just grouping students of color together in our federal reporting. So we're already kind of just making it harder to create some of those really key distinctions. I do want to give some props. Tennessee does have some really good accessible data in the fact that TDOE has downloadable Excel forms that make it really easy for partners to do their own analysis. Our higher ed agencies like TBR publishes really easily accessible data dashboards that allow you to look across student identities, both for race and gender. So there are some really positive things happening. But to Freya's points, there are questions that people aren't even asking yet, I think, in some of these agencies are not even collecting the data. And that's really where there are gaps. But additionally, I think an area where Tennessee really can improve is the utility of our state longitudinal data system, which is basically connecting the data from when a student enters the education system in K-12, and it keeps track of that student's data all through their K-12 experience into post-secondary and then into the workforce beyond that. So it kind of combines all this data from multiple different agencies and allows us to actually understand how is the overall pipeline serving students and what factors are really predictive of student success. And I think that in particular as a state is something that we haven't quite gotten the best use of yet. We have the system that exists, it has the data, but currently it's not talking to each other. It's not really accessible for most folks outside of, academics and researchers. So that's been a really large issue for SCORE. We've spent really at least 2 years now talking to partners, doing landscape analysis, understanding what is the power of this system that we have but aren't utilizing, and what are other state models that we can really follow to make sure that if we pursue legislative change in this area, we can make sure that our system is really strong and really accessible so that educators, institution leaders, nonprofits can use this data and really understand the student experience in Tennessee and where the system is kind of falling short in serving students.
Yes, to piggyback, I don't necessarily want to address whether or not there's a gap in the data in education in Tennessee, but my only concern at this point is when we know that the data is telling us a certain story, especially when it comes to equity issues, do we have enough legislation in place and good policy in place to address that? I always tell people in my college, it's 2022 when we're still addressing the same type of issue. When I came through in 2008 and I defended my dissertation dealing with the disciplinary referral gap, the over-identification of children of color in special ed program, the unidentification of students of color in gifted doctor programs, accelerated programs. We're calling it something different. We call it opportunity gap, right? And so I'm not going to say it's necessarily a gap in the data that we have, but if we have data, why aren't we doing more about it to get the train back on the track? And so that's the only concern I would like to push back on, because I think we have great data, right? Not just in the state of Tennessee, my home state of South Carolina, we got the data. But again, we don't want to tell the whole truth, right? Because if we tell the whole truth, it's going to affect somebody's pocket. We know when kids fail, it is financially empowering to certain people. When kids are being placed in incarceration, we know the pipeline. We don't want to talk about the pipeline, but I'm going to talk about it, right? Yeah, we don't want to call it school to prison. All right, don't call it that. but what do you want to call it? Whatever you want to call it, put a name to it, but they're still making people filthy rich. So we have broken policies that are in place, but they're in place for a reason. That's all I have to say on that topic. Thanks.
I think that lends itself well to our next conversation, and something that all of our fellows are thinking about constantly in their classrooms and this fellowship. And it's moving beyond the ideas of diversity and inclusion to the ideas of equity and justice, and how data can play a huge role in equity and justice conversations for students, for educators, for our schools, for our systems. And so, Farika, if you don't mind, I'll start with you about how do you think data informs those conversations, and how can it help achieve equity and justice in our schools?
I think that a lot of what people experience and what we find in research today, and what we probably know from lived experiences as well, is just that inequities compound, right? So like there's that, some people call it like an opportunity gap, some people call it that like just a debt almost that's compounded over time. And so I think when it comes to talking about equity and justice, I feel like data is powerful when it shows the long-lasting impacts that these injustices have over time. And so like thinking about the pipeline, or like whatever it may be, like the school to prison pipeline, or just like educational achievement or opportunity, I think that data can be used to highlight specific moments along a person's path and journey, or like a population's overall growth and just like lived experiences. And it can be used to really show where injustice is happening. And I think that, again, it can really help to set goals on how to make things better. I think it can like be, again, that drive and motivating and factor to create that sense of urgency about the importance of making sure that we're aiming for equity and we're aiming to right the injustices that are currently in place. So I think data is definitely like a very powerful tool, like actual scientific, like quantitative data, but also qualitative data that tells those stories that can have that emotional appeal and that emotional connection.
Dr. Thompson, talk to us about equity and justice and data.
Yeah, for the work that I'm doing, and something that's interesting, I didn't go to school to do this equity work, right? I stumbled in this journey of becoming a school teacher. But what I found out, sometimes being like one or two people of color, people assume you're doing the work. That's not always a good assumption to make about people of color. So I stumbled across this work not too long ago, several years ago. Although my research for the past 15 years dealt with especially young men of color in middle school, looking at how do they progress, do they feel welcome in the school building and whatnot. So to answer your question here, when I look at using data, even way back then in K-12, I use it for social justice in our schools. I use that data to go back to my principal and to give her an accurate depiction of what really is happening in the building. And what I had to share with her is that a lot of our teachers, all right, let's look at the data, 70, 80% of teachers in America, white females, right? In our building, we had 90% white females in our building. They had difficult experiences working with young male of color. No fault of their own. But again, let's go back to the data. If we trace our data, if we go back and look at our EPP programs, our teacher prep programs, are the curriculum set up to help those teachers who go out to the profession to be all that they can be and to be able to educate every single child in this class? And I don't think so. And so we have to diversify. When we talk about social justice, diversify the curricula and EPP programs that is going to prepare teachers to be highly successful. It doesn't matter what kind of kid sits in the classroom. It doesn't matter that kid is from a rural county. It doesn't matter from a lower SES. It doesn't matter the demographics whatsoever. All EPP should prepare students to be the student teachers become highly successful classroom teachers. I also looking at data when I was back in K-12. How do we prevent some students from going to out of school suspension? Well, we know it's always a progression, right? We know a kid gets hit with one referral and then becomes two referrals and suspension, then it progresses, right? We need to make sure it doesn't progress. Again, let's stop this train, put the train back in the track, and let's allow the train to run its course. But using data early on to paint an accurate picture and to have effective policies in place to make sure, especially children of color, are successful, that's how we can use data to fight against people who are doing injustice in our building.
And then Alexis, to close out this conversation about equity and justice, and Dr. Slay, we'll get to your question because I think it's an important one. But Alexis, if you want to just talk about equity and justice data conversation, and then we'll think about this question.
Okay, thanks, Julio. So I would say data is obviously hugely important to tell the full story, as both of my colleagues mentioned on this panel. But really the hard work of the data is sharing hard truths sometimes and shedding light on areas where the data can look bad, where there are equity gaps, opportunity gaps, and really to highlight where the education system in our state is falling short in serving students successfully. So a project that I'm really particularly proud of doing for SCORE was a report I led on summer melt, which is, I'm sure many of you are familiar, the issue where students who are interested in college, have applied for college, completed the FAFSA, never actually enroll or show up on day one, kind of fall off the pipeline in between that summer and fall. And many people that maybe are outside of the education system, even people that are in it, they just say, oh, those kids weren't college students, right? And just kind of write them off. It's an issue of these students that are often just overlooked or undervalued in the system. And we were able to not only highlight that data on who are these students, but also highlight student stories and use their own personal voices to talk about the issue in a way that really personified what summer melt was, why it was happening in our state, and how these issues are affecting students that often don't have their voices heard. And that was something that was really compelling, particularly for the policymakers in our state who don't even believe data is real sometimes. And so using student voice in particular can be a really positive tool to highlight some of these really critical issues and use that qualitative data to tell the fuller story.
Thanks. We've got some good questions coming in on the chat here, so we'll wrap up here our panel with two last questions before we move on to those three questions. But we talk, and you've mentioned it before, that data can be used to paint a story and to tell a story, and sometimes that can be dangerous, and sometimes data can be misused to tell different stories, be troubling. And so I'd love to hear how you have experienced those misuses of data, how you practice against it, and how we can be vigilant about that data. And Alexis, go ahead and continue.
Yeah, absolutely. So you all know this even better than we do as panelists, but it's critical to remember that behind every data point, we're talking about a student in a classroom that has very real personal context that is informing how they're able to show up to school every day. The same thing when we talk about educator data, there's a person behind that all the time. And so I think what I often see as, while some people may not, even if the data is accurate, like a number could be completely correct, but often it's the way data is framed in our state, but across the entire education system can be really deficit lens kind of framing. So seeing numbers of, here are the number of students that are reading on grade level, and it's framed as, well, majority of kids can't read, right? And it's always seen as, and it can be seen, especially for people who are not data driven, as attributing blame towards students and towards the educators in the classroom, rather than making the connection to, hey, this is a system level problem that we are just operating within. So I think really where I see data as important to kind of fight against is when people are focusing on, here's this thing that's happening right now,
Okay,
one
Carl.
data point, and
I
not
gotta
looking at
answer
the
the
larger
question.
picture. Perfect. Dr. Thompson, you want to jump in? Would love to hear your perspective on this.
Yes, I would like to just give one comment on this topic. I don't like when we talk about, you said something about the deficit, and I do agree with that. What I don't like when I see, especially fighting for equity concerns and issues, that if we're like 10% or 15% less than the majority as far as underperforming, we think is okay. It's not going to be okay until we could close this gap, right? There should be a gap. We live in one of the most richest countries in the world, right? We have all the technology at our disposal. We have research at our disposal. But why is it that we continue to fight for these different issues? But when I look at our children in K-12 schools that continue to struggle, and we paint the picture as if everything is good, it's not good. Because what happens to, and Alexis, you said it so brilliantly, behind every single data point, that's a child, right? So we need to give data a humanistic approach and not just look at it as some dot or a bar graph or a line graph. We have to say that is someone's child, right? Once we could humanize data and we begin to make it personal, and we treat every single dot as if that could have been one of our children, then we might look at it differently. We might do more for that data point to the point that we could erase the gap, and we won't continue to talk about different gaps in America, opportunity gaps, achievement gaps, whatever the gap. We don't need to continue to have these same conversations. Thank you.
Yep, Fareeha, if there's anything else you want to add before we move on to our last question.
I think I'm like, well, I'm thinking, I have a lot of reflections, like thinking about what everyone else has said, but also taking a look and sort of at the chat and what people are already reflecting on there. And I think that one of the most challenging things that we're dealing with today, that's not necessarily so different from it has been in the past, is just the fact that I think that so many people don't trust data, or they don't trust that the integrity of people that are putting data out there, whether that's like because of fake news or whatever it is that people believe in. And I think that I'm thinking back to the last legislative session when there was all of the anti-CRT bills and things happening. And there were times when people from EdTrust, whether they were like our students or our staff, would join and sit in on those meetings. And I would be hearing people using data or just like throwing out statistics without necessarily citing where it came from, or not necessarily like caring about the integrity of actually bringing together that data. They were just using it as almost like a weapon to create change, or like to maintain maybe a status quo that they were familiar with and comfortable in. And so I think that definitely when it comes to data misuse, there is a lot. It is oftentimes misused to maintain privilege and to like maintain certain power dynamics that already exist. So looking forward to the rest of this conversation, but also just wanted to recognize that like that is definitely something that I think everyone in advocacy, in research, struggles with today.
Thanks. And then final question before we move on to these great questions that are probably up in the chat and any of our other fellows. Just very simply, what do you hope are the takeaways that all of our educators take away from this data conversation today, of how to use data, how to think about data, how to access it? Fareeha, we'll start with you, and then we'll go around the horn to Dr. Thompson and Alexis before we open up the Q&A.
Sure. I hope I hope that we all can recognize that data can be used to combat some of that cynicism that I feel like we're feeling. Like, it can be disheartening to see negative data, but I also think that sometimes it reminds us that there's room for growth. And when we see changes in the data, like, that can be uplifting. And I think it can be a really powerful part of all of our stories, in addition to just like the individual stories of our students and everything that they've done. But I think as a teacher, like, some of the most powerful things that I witnessed was really seeing like a student's grade change, like that improvement and whatever that may be. So from a local level to a state level, national level, data it's powerful, and it can be a source of optimism. And if done with integrity, like, it can do a lot of good for the world that we live in.
Dr. Thompson, if you can hear us, go ahead.
Yes. I would like for every fellow out there to take from this conversation dealing with data is allow data to drive your motivation. Allow data to be the change that you want to see in your schools. Don't let people fool you as if that you have to have a PhD or some advanced degree, right, to make sense of this data. Because a lot of people are, and I've heard it, a lot of people using data to tell their own narrative. No, use the data to tell the truth and lean on it. You don't have to use data to scare people, but use data to tell the truth. And that's what I hope we get out of this conversation today.
Thanks, Dr. Thompson. So I would I'm really going to echo similar things to what my colleagues have said, but I think coming out of this, you're part of this fellowship, you're already being strong advocates, but continue to be strong advocates, support your schools to be data-driven, even if it's just within your own classroom, really using data, to Dr. Thompson's point, to tell the truth, even if that's a hard truth. And also celebrate the growth that you see when data is powerful, when it can you can see that change in a student's trajectory, really every single piece of your classroom experience. Every time a student hands in a piece of homework, that's a piece of data. And so I think just make sure that you're taking in every piece of that you can, make data-driven decisions in your classroom, and celebrate the growth when it happens.
Thank you, all three of you, for joining our panel today. We're going to open up the Q&A here from our cohort. And the first one, there's 3 questions in the chat that I think all are similar. And I think it goes to how you present this data. It's great when we talk about it with each other, but how do you present it to policymakers, to the people making the rules, who maybe don't have an education background, who aren't educators or researchers? How do you make that data accessible to them? And how do you tell the story so that actual positive change can happen in our schools? And Alexis, I'll start with you, knowing how much work SCORE does around that area.
Yeah, absolutely. So want to thank you for this question. It's really, really important. And I think something that we've already touched on is when you just put the data out there, if someone doesn't understand data or, isn't a data-driven person, they're just going to see bars on a chart. They're not going to know what you're talking about. So something that I really work on within my own organization and making sure that our advocacy team always has with them is not just the data point, but putting the actual takeaway with that data point. So making sure that even if a person doesn't know what's actually going on with the numbers, they know what it means, what the takeaway is there. And really always aligning with those insights is super helpful, just to make sure that the point really comes across. And often with policymakers, especially in this state, it's about being really creative and identifying things that those folks care about and making connections there. Because you can say all day long, this is a really critical issue. Here's a massive equity issue in our state. And they just nod their heads and say, okay, yeah, whatever, I don't really care. So finding something that connects to what they are passionate about, what they do believe in, can be really powerful.
If y'all don't mind, can I give a little background of where the whole idea came from? So I was in a meeting about 3 years ago, and they was talking to us about how poverty affects education and things like that. And I asked the question, do you feel that you need racism to fuel capitalism? And it was a question that went unanswered. It was like, I don't want to think like that because it's kind of hopeless. And some of our children feel that way, right? And I was a 5th grade teacher, and I knew that I could close my door and make sure the students got what they need to be successful. But I don't think not everybody was privileged to have a teacher like that. And so we've gotten a few policies, well, more than a few. We've gotten a whole lot of policies from a place that seems like it has good intentions, but it's detrimental to students of color. Some would say all students. You have the policy about the Appropriate Materials Act, right? That they don't want to say it, but it's censorship. You have the policy about the 3rd grade literacy law, where there are some loopholes that I feel like may be exploited, and you may see more children of color having IEPs or things like that so that they can have a loophole in the system. And these are things that are like, it's going to be detrimental to the students. And so that's where that came from.
Dr. Thompson, were you going to jump in there?
Yeah, I haven't, I believe back in 2011, I participated in educational policy fellowship program in the state of South Carolina. And I was in this 1-year fellowship, and they geared us the entire year about, how do you present data to some elected officials who might not even care about the data. And I believe Alexis has already said this, but we have to find, regardless of your political party or political affiliation, you have to find something that they really like, and you have to run with that. You might not agree with people's opinions when it comes to public policies or what they have voted on in the past, but these are the people that's going to either vote something up for you or vote something down. But the young man who just gave his comments, the former 5th grade teacher, I applaud you for what you said. There are policies in place, and I really believe that there are policies in place that's going to trip up certain students. We said something about the 3rd grade reading score. Guess what? My oldest child is in the 3rd grade, and that's the only thing that comes to my mind first thing in the morning, and the only thing that I think about when I go to sleep at night is whether or not she's going to pass this test. And if she doesn't pass this test, what's going to happen then? I shouldn't have to worry about all of this. But why is it in the 3rd grade? I mean, why aren't we catching students early on in the kindergarten, 1st grade? Why 3rd grade? And of course, someone's going to say because the data reports that if students don't do well in the 3rd grade, the school to prison pipeline. I've heard that story too. But we need to change the narrative. We need to have better policies in place, not roadblocks, not certain policies that going to equip certain students to be successful, but effective policies that's going to affect all students, that all students will be successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. Dr. Welch, you asked a question in the chat. Do you want to ask it to our panelists and see if any of them want to hop in on it?
Sure. I had a question. Well, we have our particular administrator, we create a data wall, and I teach pre-K. We do all this work to like break down our data, and it's really not that hard. I mean, because it's pre-K. but yet we don't look at it again for the rest of the school year. And it's like, why did we just go through all of this? And I feel like it's, it's important to revisit that data. I mean, even if it's, it's just simple data, since pre-K is kind of in like a war situation where it's like people are discounting it and it's like, oh, it's just, daycare or whatever the case may be. But what do you do when you have, an admin that literally does stuff and we're doing this, but why are we doing it? And we don't even revisit the information that you had us, spend all this time collecting and organizing and whatever, but we don't touch it again.
I'd say, Dr. Welch, and I'll let the data people jump in here after I think about it. But at first, I think it's so important that you're doing this data work and that you understand, like Alexis said, the students behind the data. For me, when I was teaching, it was to constantly bring this back up in meetings of, we're talking about this from a qualitative standpoint. Let's bring in the data in every conversation we're having about our students, whether it's a parent-teacher conference, whether it's with a principal, whether it's a disciplinary or an academic conversation. Bring in those numbers that you looked at the beginning of the year, and don't let your administrator or your other team members forget that data matters. Because even in your own classroom, that data can inform how you teach, how you connect parents to their students, how the students connect to their own work, and share it with the students. Even at pre-K, I think there's a way you can share data with students and help them connect to what those numbers mean, so that in their later life, they can connect to their numbers as they get them in third grade, get them in fifth grade, get them in middle school and high school, and they start becoming data-minded about their own academic journey.
I would just like to kind of piggyback off of what Dr. Welch was saying. And let me explain why I feel that it is important to have those conversations with your pre-K babies. So I teach special ed. I have a first grader, I have a second grader, I have a fourth grader, and I have a fifth grader. And those students are considered low incidence, or some of you all may be familiar with the term for that classroom, life skills. What I do with my students and their parents and gen ed teachers that they're in contact with, I use two things. The first thing I tell them is missed, MISSED, information leads to misinformation. Missed, MISSED, communication leads to miscommunication. These data points that you all are getting, these tests that you all are taking, I understand that, it doesn't, for you, it doesn't really mean a whole lot, but for everybody else that's looking and for everyone else that's watching, it does. And let me tell you what this means. And then I have conversations. So like I break it down for my students. So then when I talk to the gen ed teachers, I say, well, this is what it says. On my side of the fence, I'm doing XXX. And it is bringing up the foundational skills that they need to be able to push closer to these benchmarks. So what I need you to do on your side of the fence is XXX to help push them up even further. Now, what does that do when I talk to parents? Hey, your child has an IEP goal. It says 4 out of 5 opportunities at 85% mastery, yada, yada, yada. That's what they're supposed to be able to do within a full calendar year of this IEP. How can you help do that? Well, this is where they are. They are at 65%. How can we get the other 20%? This is what you do at home with them. It is real natural teaching. It is not anything that's like really drawn out, long, and involved. It is hitting this particular skill using this. It is hitting this particular skill and using this. I don't believe that, and this is just me, I don't believe that children are only educated in the classroom. They are educated as soon as their eyes are open. They are looking and they are involved and they are submersed in learning opportunities their full day that they are conscious. So what I try to make sure that my students as well as their other teachers and the other stakeholders and parents understand that this is where here's how you move the needle. Here's how you change the data. So in saying that, I have a student who is on alternative assessment. If anybody knows about that, it is a different set of standards that Tennessee has for students who are cognitively, their cognitive deficits are severe. I have a student that took the TN Alt last year. When the data came back this year, it says that he was at approaching. Let me say this again. He was at approaching, where he would have been able to take the regular TN Ready test and been okay. But what happened was, back in August of 2021, I put a bug in everybody's ear. I got on everybody's nerves. This is the data. This is what he can do. This is what I'm going to be working on. This is how he's working and doing this. When Dr. Thompson everybody has been talking about the human aspect. I never say that data point is just a number. It is attached to a person. It is attached to a kid. It is attached to a hope. It is attached to a dream. If we humanize, as it's been said, then yes, we can push past. But the other side of the problem is people have worked and operated for years systemically and financially in privileged politics. So those are those decision makers that are sitting there making policies. And what we have to do is change some of the people that are sitting in those seats. Because if you change the people that are sitting in the seats, you change the perspective, you change the trajectory. But I'm rambling, but that is just pretty much kind of my passion for what I do, is because I want to move the needle. And I understand that there's a way to be able to move it without taking our eyes on the prize. And I just hope that as we move and matriculate throughout this whole fellowship, that's something that we keep in the forefront of our minds. And that's what we keep the passion of pushing forward to. That's all.
That is such a great example, and thank you for sharing that of our cohort working together, and these conversations that we have here should open the door for each other to connect with, because we're doing the work, and you're in the classroom still connecting with each other. So thanks again for sharing that, Dr. Welch. I hope you can connect there more fully, because I think there's some great stuff that just happened there. Being mindful of time here. Are there any further questions that we have for our three panelists before we move on to the final part of today's gathering?
I just want to make sure we acknowledge Portia's question in the chat too. Talking about if we can address the source, how do we chip away at some of these gaps? I think that's such an incredible question. And I want to make sure we chat about that just a little bit. I think we've talked a lot about today that a lot of these issues are system level issues. So it can feel really hard to actually create real solutions that don't just feel like, putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. So I think such a good question. And I think part of it really is making those big policy changes and connecting that with the practice every single day in the classroom. And making sure that the implementation of these programs that I believe James said it earlier, can be well-intentioned, but have negative impacts on students actually, especially when they're not implemented properly. It's really about creating those connections between the policy and the practice and making sure that as the school ecosystem, you're really aware of, okay, how is this going to impact our day-to-day and how can we work together to make sure that we're really being effective in serving students under these new conditions.
I just want to say that my whole idea behind that was more, I think we understand why our kids are behind. And a lot of it has to do with just, our status in society a lot of times. And we know that the status quo is not going to address that. They're refusing to address that. So I just feel like I think we can do as much as we can in the classroom, but I also think we also need to be in the face of policymakers, letting them know that you're probably not gonna like this, but this is the reality of a lot of children in our seats, in our classrooms. And a lot of it has to do with poverty. And we cannot like compare them to these wealthier students and stuff when they're getting all the resources they can get while ours are not. And so I think they just need to be aware of that at all times. And they, you know, because I see it in my city, you know, it's some things that were being said by policymakers. It was just very outright racist and elitist, and you know, just that reminder of, you know, I think one of our policymakers was saying something about the Hispanic students coming in and how it's creating a burden on the system, and it was just very racist and elitist. And but that whole idea of, you know, a lot of teachers started speaking. I was like, no, these students are not a burden. You know, it's because you're in this position of power that you consider them a burden. And I think we just really need to be in policymakers' faces. Just like, you know, I'm a teacher and these are my students and this is what's happening. It's great things happening. And we need money. We need a lot of money. That's a lot of it is we need money. So, but in the meantime, like, how can we chip away at this gap? What can we put into place and you know, to help with that? So yeah.
Seeing no one jumping in here. That's a big question. But let's continue thinking about it because I want to get an answer for you there. Dr. Thompson.
Let me jump in because
Yeah.
That's an excellent question. I don't call it necessarily a loaded question. I call it a question that we as a country been dealing with for the last 60, 70 years, right? They put legislation in place. We're talking about Brown v. Board back in the day. And we're talking about equity issues, equality issues, but it goes back to equity. And we're still having the same conversations. And I already addressed this earlier. There's mechanisms in place, obstacles in place to keep certain students where they are. I don't care how many times we have this conversation, it is already designed for certain students not to make it. A lot of people may hear this talk later and may disagree with me. That's perfectly okay. But the only thing I would like to raise is this: why are we still having the same conversation? If we're in one of the most wealthiest countries in the world and we're still trying to figure out this gap, that's the problem. That's very problematic. And so doing this type of work and being in education since 2002, and I'm always having these conversations, and I'm working with the local school district in Clarksville now, and I have 3 kids in the elementary schools, and I see the stuff that my children go through. It's by design. My wife is well educated, I'm well educated, and we still deal with some of the same problems. It's because of who you are. All right, so I'm not making no excuses, but to address that question, I believe instead of me trying to knock on a legislator's door or trying to get to the Hill and voice my opinion, I want to do everything that I can within my power. So within my circle of influence, that means within Austin Peay, within the College of Education, that's where I have my influence. That's where I want to work at, right? So if I can make a small dent in the huge problem and do my part, maybe I can make an impact one day.
And I think also just piggybacking off of that, this system is in place from top to bottom, and it's been that way forever. It was built that way. And so I think something that I'm really trying to also remember and be cognizant of thinking about like, you know, our spheres of influence is that there are people all along that ladder of privilege that play a role in maintaining it. And so sometimes like it doesn't have to be us going straight to like our legislators. Sometimes it could be going up to definitely like school boards or local officials if you have the like, if you are able to do that in the context that you're in, or also sometimes working with parents or various advocacy organizations that exist. Sometimes those community organizations, I feel like, are a lot of places where people are able to come together and really have their voices into it, like uplifted. And I think that collective gathering and coalition building can be really beneficial and powerful as we try to create those like small changes in the spheres of influence that we have in the communities around us.
If there are no more questions, I'm going to practice my wait time here for a minute, but otherwise, I'm going to thank the panelists, Alexis, Fariha, Dr. Thompson, for joining us. Dr. Thompson, we'll let you get on with your day and your family. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all. We're going to break here for just 4 minutes, and at 2:15, we'll come back to wrap up, and I promise I'll get you out of here by 2:30. Please come back by 2:15. And thank you to the 3 panelists today.
Excuse me.
Thank you. Y'all have a great day. Thank you so much.
Excuse me. Hello? Hello?
Hi, Constance. Sorry, your audio cut out there at the end. What's up?
Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to ask the panelists how they felt. I hear a lot of what they were saying, but I didn't hear anybody really talk about the importance of the students, important that role is in a child's education. I was thinking about Ms. Moore when we were in our small group, and even though, you know, yes, we do have to, as African Americans or people of color, have to fight a little bit harder for our kids to receive the same education. But as a parent, like Summer was talking about, and like I've done, and like other people, no, you have to go in and fight for your, you know, to make sure that your child gets that same education. And so I was wondering, and then there's so many situations where, you know, a kid is capable, but they don't have that family support. And that's where the problem is that they don't have anybody at home pushing them to reach their full potential. So I didn't hear parents or the guardians of these kids.
So I couldn't quite hear your full question. I think I'm the only panelist left on the call, so I'll do my best to answer the question. But it sounded like, how are we supporting students in particular who maybe don't have parents that are advocating on their behalf? Julio, does that sound right? I missed part of the question.
Yeah, I think probably, and Constance, if you want to type in your question in the chat, because we're having a little bit of audio problems with your connection, but maybe also talk about access that students and parents can have to their own data and how educators can connect them to that data as well. But I think those 2 questions.
Perfect. So yeah, I think really a huge part of this is, when possible, absolutely engage those families, have those conversations with parents, make sure they're aware of whether it's the portals that they can get on where they can actually see their own student trajectory, connecting them with those resources whenever possible, and also connecting them with the other folks that you're aware of that have influence, right? Encouraging folks to be advocates, to talk to their school board members, talk to their local legislators about the issues that they care about, but also really supporting our students to be advocates for themselves, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are going to have to continue to support themselves once they get into college and beyond. So really helping them to be advocates and use their voices and really encouraging that, I think is a great resource that all of you can be capable of in your own classrooms, whether it's pre-K students or high school students. But I think in terms of the parent accountability piece, it's just really hard. And I don't know if, we're ever going to get to a point where we can really change parent involvement, just because people have all different kinds of contexts and abilities. But I think really making sure that when possible, we can use those parents who are engaged to use their voices and their influence in the classroom space can be really, really powerful. Julio, would love your perspective too, though.
Yeah, I'm looking here at Constance's question, and we'll close out here because I want to send you, and I want to close out our session so the educators can get the rest of their Saturday back. But Constance, that's a great question of parent involvement. We're going to have a session later this curriculum on parent involvement and parent engagement with nonprofits who are doing specifically this work on parent engagement. But I think data is a huge part of that, of making parents feel like they're co-owners of their children's education, not just when they get home, but during the whole school day of how can I track my students' progress, not just from test scores, but in all the data that schools have, whether it's demographic data, academic data, institutional data, all of that work. And even before school starts and before you get your elementary school started is understanding the data of the school you're zoned for, the data of the schools that are popping up in your neighborhood, all the demographic information of your neighborhood, all that's important. So for me, data access is huge in parent involvement, of making data not just available, but also understandable and readable of parents who maybe aren't researchers and don't have data backgrounds. But if that data can be easily accessed, easily read, that's a good way to get them engaged. And a good way to track their kids' educations in a quantitative way during those 12 years of public education. Hopefully that answers that question a little bit. But yeah, engagement also looks very different in a lot of ways, Portia. I think that's right, that engagement isn't just about, I think there's a lot of racial and economic undertones and when we talk about parent engagement, because a lot of times engagement just means that between my 3 jobs, which was my experience growing up with my mom, is that my kid's at school every day, Monday through Friday. And that's engagement, because otherwise it'd be very easy for me not to see my kids ever go to school because I'm not there working. So engagement looks a lot of different ways. It exists in different ways in schools. And Portia, I think that's a very good point, that poor working parents have different engagement levels that they can have as rich educated parents who have maybe one working and one at home. That parent can be in the school all day, every day. And you've probably seen them in your own classrooms of PTOs who are predominantly white and rich. So, and that's a conversation we'll have later down the road. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Dr. Welch, language is so important. When you talk to parents, making sure that you're talking to them at a level that you both can engage with and feel ownership and responsible for, that you're not trying to talk over a parent's head, because then that parent's not going to want to come and engage in their school's education because they're going to feel dumb. So good points there. Great conversation. I'm going to share my screen here so that I can get you all out of here an hour early. Fingers crossed. And again, I appreciate all your time and those questions to our panel here. The last part of today's conversation is about our equity project. I'm going to go through these slides pretty quick because you all know what they are. You all know what your problem statements are at this point. I'm pretty sure we've received problem statements from everyone. And these are just slides that Renee wanted all of you to see. I'll post these also in the drive so you can go back and reference them. But just want to make sure that we see where we've been at. We've already talked about the inputs and the resources for Equity Project. the activities that you're going to be talking about that we outlined prior to today's session, and where we are today on the outputs. The product delivered or unit of service provided, number of people served, number of hours of service. And so this is in your problem statement. This is the example we came up with at the orientation of frequently approached to discipline students. And we've talked about this a lot over the past couple of months that we've been together. The sample inputs we came up with were meeting spaces, buy-in from leadership, buy-in from educators, student level data, and then the activities. We thought about cross-cultural affinity groups, collect student level discipline data, all of that we've done, we've covered. The outputs here are the direct products that your program, that your ideas are going to be servicing and delivering to your school, to your classroom, to your district. So the activity, we're starting an affinity group. Now we need to know what are the times, the activity, how many people are we targeting? These outcomes are the specific changes that your program, your idea is going to influence. Short-term outcomes should be attainable within this school year, the next school year, the next 3. Long-terms 4 to 6. Anything beyond 6 is unrealistic and hard to track. And so here's where we're at with our problem statement. Again, with these, with our sample from this summer at orientation, the sample output's going to be maybe 3 training sessions, a peer developed resource list. 90% of staff are attending these peer affinity groups. Other sample outcomes written out in a sense, discipline in their home room so that you're not pulling out other educators to discipline other people's students. Are there any questions so far about where we are with our equity project on outcomes?
Is there a way that this can be, once you stick it in the drive, I can download it, correct? Because I'm working with somebody else. I'm working with the outside source, so I just need to give it to her so that she has it.
This will be in the drive in important documents. You'll see it under session 3 slides.
Okay.
And then we'll also pull this up again on Sunday when we're in our peer mentor groups. Good question.
All right, thank you.
And so for next week and then for November especially, start thinking about those outputs and the outcomes. What do you want your program to do? What's the time range you want it to do? And how will you deliver those things? Really the realistic stuff of your project and why it needs to exist, why you came up with it. If there's no reason for it to exist, then your school's never going to look at it. So this is the important part of what we give to our school boards, our administrators, our other teachers, for them to buy into the project. And again, you don't need to type anything up, no writing, just either come with a list to the November session, type up some bullet points. I think probably a good number would be 5 to 7 outputs that we're going to be able to whittle down to about 3 and 4 really good ones. And then the outcomes, maybe 3 to 4. Maybe 2 who are short-term, 1 to 3 years, and then 1 or 2 that are long-term, 5 to 7 year outcomes that you're going to be able to track and manage. Again, these outcomes can be small, but they also must be able to be tracked. And then any questions before I move on to the last part? Cool. If you're not tired of TECA yet, next Saturday before we meet on Sunday, there's a free event in Memphis. It's open to anyone. Our facilitator in residence, Kia Jarman, who you've all met and heard from, is leading a session. She's going to be doing some great work about just being creative, about sharing stories, about taking care of yourselves, mental health. We'll have food, we'll have drinks afterwards. We'll go to a happy hour all together. I won't be there. Renee and Christian, I think, will be there. But if you're in the Memphis area, free event. And if you want more information, you can email me about it. And then before I let all of you go, as always, I need to give you all our exit survey, because this is what will inform our next conversation. And these are how we kind of track attendance as well. So there's the link. You are free to take the link, complete the survey, now. If you have any questions about it, take it with you and fill it out the rest of the day. But please make sure to turn this survey in by the end of today. Are there any questions from any educators, any of our fellows, before we close out today's session? Cool. Well, as a reminder, this recording will also be posted in the Drive. If there's something you want to go back and watch, whether it's from the data session this morning, from our panel, from this housekeeping stuff at the end, these slides will also be posted in the Drive. So you'll be able to go back and reference all of that stuff about outcomes and the outputs of our equity projects. And if you have any questions, you are more than welcome to please email me, shoot me a message on the GroupMe. Otherwise, we'll see you next Sunday for our peer mentor groups. Go back and check those groups on your email. And I'm going to give you all back at least half an hour of your Saturday. But thank you all so much for joining today. Fill out the survey and we'll see you Sunday. And I'm going to hang around here if there's any questions, but otherwise you're free to go. Bye, Portia.
I'm just filling out the survey before I go.
Great. I love that. Thank you, Dr. Slay.
Me too.
Not yet. I'm not Dr. Slay yet.
Look, we're speaking it into existence.
Yes, I claim it. I claim it. Yes.
Words have power. If we start saying it, it'll happen.
Absolutely. I start writing my dissertation in the summer.
Well, we'll keep a close eye on that. We'll bring you back on as Dr. Slay, the panelist. We'll transition to that next role.
Good luck, James. I did this 6 years ago. You got this. You can do it.
I don't know. We're going to try to.
Have a good week, everybody. Those on fall break, enjoy.
Thank you. You too. Oh, we got 9 responses already. Wow.
All right, y'all have a good one.
Thank you,
Bye,
James.
James. Have a great fall break.
Hey, y'all too. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
All right,
Thank you so much. It was great. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, you too. I'm going to go ahead and close the Zoom room. So if you have any questions, please send me an email. Bye, everyone.